When Garrett Hale found a woman abandoned at a muddy crossroads during the worst storm Wyoming had seen in a decade, he never imagined that saving her life would destroy everything he thought he knew about himself. What happens when a broken city woman and a hardened rancher are forced together by fate in the brutal frontier? This is their story, raw, complicated, and absolutely unforgettable. If you're watching from somewhere in this world, drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story travels. And stick around until the end. You won't believe where this goes. Hit that like button and let's begin. The storm hit without warning. One moment the sky was bruised purple, heavy and waiting. The next, it split open like something torn apart by angry hands. Rain didn't fall, it attacked. Horizontal sheets of water driven by wind that howled across the Wyoming prairie like a living thing with teeth. Garrett Hale should have been home an hour ago. Instead, he was fighting to keep his horse, Duke, moving forward through mud that sucked at every step. The gelding's ears were pinned flat, nostrils flaring wide as lightning cracked so close Garrett smelled the burnt ozone in the air. "Come on, boy," he muttered, leaning low against Duke's neck. "Just get us to the ridge." He'd spent the day in town, a wasted trip that left him with nothing but a lighter wallet and confirmation that frontier life never got easier, only familiar. The feed store had raised prices again. The bank had smiled while explaining why his loan extension was denied. And the new sheriff, some kid from Kansas who thought a badge made him important, had given Garrett a lecture about settling his bar tab. Garrett was 32 years old. He'd built his homestead from nothing, survived 3 brutal winters, lost more cattle to disease and drought than he cared to count, and still managed to keep his land when other men had given up and crawled back east. He didn't need lectures from boys who'd never felt real dirt under their fingernails. The rain intensified. Thunder rolled across the plain, a sound so deep it vibrated in his chest. Duke stumbled, caught himself, kept moving. Good horse. Stubborn as hell, just like his owner. That's when Garrett saw it. At first he thought the storm was playing tricks, shapes in the rain that didn't make sense. But as Duke crested the small rise near the crossroads, the image sharpened into something impossible. A woman, sitting on a trunk beside the road. Alone, Garrett pulled Duke to a halt, blinking water from his eyes. No, that couldn't be right. Nobody would be out here. Not in this. Not sitting like she was waiting for a Sunday carriage instead of drowning in a summer storm that could kill her in hours. He urged Duke closer. She didn't move. The woman sat perfectly still on a battered leather trunk, hands folded in her lap like she was posing for a photograph. Her dress, some expensive-looking thing that might have been blue or gray, impossible to tell in the rain, was plastered to her skin. Her dark hair hung in ropes around her face. She was shaking so hard Garrett could see it from 10 feet away. But she wasn't crying, wasn't calling for help, wasn't doing anything except sitting there like she'd already accepted whatever came next. "Ma'am?" Garrett had to shout over the wind. She didn't react. He swung down from Duke, boots hitting mud with a wet squelch. The rain was cold despite the summer heat, driven hard enough to sting exposed skin. "Ma'am, you need to get out of this weather." Still nothing. Garrett moved closer, and finally, her head turned. The face that looked up at him was young, maybe mid-20s, with features that would have been pretty under different circumstances. Right now, she just looked hollow, empty, like someone had scooped out whatever lived behind her eyes and left the shell sitting in the rain. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." Her voice was barely audible. "What are you doing out here?" "Waiting." "For what?" She blinked slowly. Water ran down her face in rivulets. "I don't know anymore." Jesus Christ, the woman was in shock. Garrett looked around, searching for a wagon, a horse, anything that explained how she'd gotten here. Nothing. Just empty prairie and the storm trying to tear the world apart. "Where did you come from?" "The train station. In Hartley." Hartley was 8 miles back, 8 miles through terrain that was difficult even in good weather. "You walked?" "The driver brought me." She paused. "Most of the way. Then he said he wasn't going any further and left me here. Said someone would come." "Who?" Something flickered in her expression, not quite pain, not quite anger, something colder. "A man named Nathaniel Crawford. He was supposed to meet me. We were supposed to—" She trailed off, looking away. Garrett knew the name. Everyone in 3 counties knew Nathaniel Crawford. Rich family, big ranch, connections that stretched all the way to Washington. The kind of man who thought the world existed to serve his convenience. The kind of man who would absolutely leave a woman stranded at a crossroads if it suited him. How long have you been sitting here? She considered the question like it required real thought. The driver left around noon, I think. What time is it now? Garrett didn't have a watch, but the light was nearly gone. Past 6, probably closer to 7. Oh. She said it like it didn't matter. Like sitting in a deadly storm for 7 hours was just mildly interesting information. Lightning struck close enough that Duke shied, yanking at the reins Garrett had looped around his wrist. The thunder that followed was immediate, a sound like the sky breaking in half. This was insane. They were both going to die if he didn't do something. Can you stand? I think so. Then do it, now. He didn't mean to sound harsh, but shock killed people. Shock made them compliant, passive, willing to sit in the rain until hypothermia or lightning finished the job. She needed to move, needed to engage with reality instead of whatever frozen place her mind had retreated to. His tone worked. She stood, unsteadily, using the trunk for support, and faced him. Up close, he could see she was taller than average, with a frame that suggested strength beneath the expensive dress. Not a pampered city girl, or at least not entirely, something more complicated. What's your name? Vivian Mercer. I'm Garrett Hale. My homestead is about 40 minutes north if we push hard. You're coming with me. I should wait for... Nobody's coming. He cut her off, not cruel, but final. Crawford isn't coming. That driver isn't coming back. If you stay here, you die. Simple as that. She absorbed this with that same hollow expression. Then slowly she nodded. Can you ride? I've never... You're learning today. He grabbed the trunk, testing its weight. Heavy. Too heavy to bring. Anything in here you can't live without? Everything I own is in there. Pick one thing. Fast. She stared at him like he'd asked her to choose which arm to cut off. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the clasps. The trunk opened to reveal neatly folded clothes, books, small wrapped packages. A whole life packed into leather and brass. Vivian stood frozen, looking at her possessions like they belonged to someone else. Miss Mercer, one thing, now. She reached in and pulled out a small wooden box, about the size of a Bible. That was it. Nothing else. She closed the trunk carefully, hands lingering on the wet leather like she was saying goodbye. Let's go. Getting her on Duke took longer than it should have. She had no idea how to mount, kept trying to climb up side saddle like she'd seen in paintings, and nearly fell twice. Finally, Garrett just grabbed her waist and lifted her into the saddle, then swung up behind her. She went rigid at the contact. You're going to have to relax, Garrett said. Hold on to the saddle horn. I've got you. This isn't proper? Yeah, I know. You want proper or you want alive? She didn't answer, but her hands found the horn and gripped tight. Garrett spurred Duke into motion, angling northeast toward home. The gelding responded immediately, understanding that shelter and dry hay waited at the end of this misery. Smart horse. They rode in silence for 20 minutes. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was getting worse. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and Garrett could feel Vivian shaking against him, whether from cold or shock or both. He couldn't tell. Why did you come to Wyoming? He asked it partly to keep her conscious, partly because he was genuinely curious what drove an educated woman from New York to the frontier. I was told it was an opportunity. For what? A different life. You get that in a letter? From Crawford? Yes. Her voice was barely audible over the rain. He wrote beautiful letters, described his ranch, the mountains, the endless sky, made it sound like paradise. And you believed him? I wanted to. Garrett felt something twist in his chest. He recognized that particular brand of desperation. The need to believe in something better, even when reality kept proving you wrong. He'd felt it himself years ago, when he'd first come west thinking he could outrun his past. Turned out the past was patient. It didn't chase you. It just waited for you to stop moving. How long did you correspond? 6 months. Every week. She paused. His last letter arrived 2 weeks ago. He said the wedding would be the day after I arrived. That everything was arranged. That I should bring my finest dress because he wanted to show me off to the whole territory. Did you? Did I what? Bring your finest dress? It's in the trunk, she said it flatly, along with everything else I thought I'd need for my new life. They crested a ridge and Garrett's homestead came into view below, a dark shape against darker landscape, barely visible through the rain. The main cabin, the barn, a couple of outbuildings that hadn't collapsed yet. Not much, but it was his. Duke smelled home and picked up the pace without prompting. "We're almost there," Garrett said. "You're going to be all right." Vivian didn't respond, but he felt her grip tighten on the saddle horn, and he chose to interpret that as hope. They reached the barn 15 minutes later. Garrett dismounted first, then helped Vivian down. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet touched ground. 7 hours of sitting, followed by 40 minutes of riding, had done their damage. He caught her elbow, steadying her. "Can you walk?" "Yes." She was lying, but he appreciated the effort. He led Duke into the barn, Vivian following slowly. The interior was dark but dry, and the absence of wind felt like a physical relief. Garrett lit the lantern hanging by the door, and warm light pushed back the shadows. Duke went straight to his stall, ready to be done with the whole experience. Garrett unsaddled him quickly, wiped him down, made sure he had water and feed. The horse had earned it. Vivian stood near the door, still holding that wooden box, dripping water onto the packed dirt floor. She was staring at nothing again, that hollow look back in her eyes. "House is 50 feet that way." Garrett pointed. "Make a run for it or wait for me?" "Wait." "Smart." He finished with Duke, grabbed the lantern, and led her out into the storm again. 50 feet felt like 50 miles with the wind trying to knock them over and rain hammering down hard enough to hurt. But they made it to the cabin door, stumbled inside, and Garrett kicked it shut behind them. The sudden absence of noise was disorienting. Garrett set the lantern on the table and surveyed his home through a stranger's eyes. One main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A small bedroom off to the left. Everything rough-hewn and functional. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. The kind of place built by a man who expected to die alone and didn't see the point in comfort. Vivian stood just inside the door, dripping, shaking, looking around like she'd stepped into a cave. "You need dry clothes," Garrett said. "I don't have—" "I know. Use mine." He went to the bedroom, dug through his trunk, and came back with a flannel shirt and wool pants. "They'll be huge, but they're dry. Change in there." He nodded toward the bedroom. "I'll get a fire going." She took the clothes without argument and disappeared. Garrett turned his attention to the fireplace. The wood was dry, the kindling ready. He always kept it prepared because frontier life punished unpreparedness. Within minutes, he had flames crackling, heat beginning to push into the room. Vivian emerged wearing his clothes. He'd been right. The shirt hung to her knees, the pants had to be rolled up several times, just so she could walk. She looked ridiculous and vulnerable, and somehow tougher than she had in that expensive dress. "Sit near the fire," he said. "Warm up." She moved to the hearth and sank down onto the floor, extending her hands toward the flames. Her dark hair was still wet, hanging loose around her face. She'd taken it down from whatever style she'd been wearing. Garrett went to change his own clothes, then returned and started making coffee. Not because either of them needed it, but because the familiar routine gave him something to do while trying to figure out what the hell happened next. "You have a nice home." Vivian's voice was quiet, but clearer now, like warmth was bringing her back to herself. Garrett almost laughed. "It's 4 walls and a roof that doesn't leak much. It's more than I have right now." "Fair point." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. She wrapped both hands around it, absorbing the heat. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire pop inside. Garrett found himself studying her in profile, the sharp intelligence in her eyes even through exhaustion, the set of her jaw that suggested stubbornness, the way she held herself despite everything that had happened. "Why didn't you go back to the train station?" he asked finally. "And then what? Return to New York?" She shook her head. "There's nothing for me there." "Family?" "Dead. My parents died from influenza 2 years ago. I have a sister in Boston, but we—" She paused. "We haven't spoken in a long time." "Friends?" "The kind that disappear when you have no money and no prospects." She took a sip of coffee, made a face at how strong it was, but drank anyway. Coming west was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to build something new. "With a man you'd never met." with a man who promised me a partnership, who said he wanted an educated wife, someone who could help manage a ranch, who could be more than just decoration. Her voice had an edge now. His letters made it sound like he respected intelligence, valued it even. And you needed to be valued. She looked at him sharply. Doesn't everyone? I suppose. What about you? She turned the question around. Why are you out here alone? Who says I'm alone? This cabin says it. One plate on the table, one cup, no photographs, no personal items. You live like a man who expects nobody to visit and prefers it that way. Garrett felt something uncomfortable shift in his chest. She wasn't wrong. I came west 7 years ago. Bought this land cheap because it was far from everything and nobody else wanted it. Built the cabin, started the ranch, kept my head down. Running from something? Walking away from something. There's a difference. Is there? He didn't answer. Didn't owe her his history just because he'd pulled her out of a storm. Vivian seemed to sense she'd pushed too far. I'm sorry. You saved my life tonight. I shouldn't interrogate you. You're not interrogating. You're making conversation because silence makes the situation uncomfortable. He paused. And because you're trying to figure out if I'm dangerous. Her expression shifted, surprise, then something like respect. Am I that obvious? You're smart to wonder. You don't know me. For all you know, I could be worse than Crawford. Are you? Garrett met her eyes. No. Then I'll choose to believe you. She said it simply, like trust was a conscious decision rather than something earned. Maybe for her it was. The storm hammered on, the fire crackled. Outside, the Wyoming night was black and violent, but inside the cabin felt almost peaceful. You can stay here tonight, Garrett said. Take the bedroom. I'll sleep out here. I can't take your bed. You can and you will. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. Figure out what? What you're going to do. Where you're going to go. How you're going to survive. Vivian stared into her coffee cup. I have $43 to my name. Everything else I owned is in that trunk beside the road. We'll get it tomorrow if the storm breaks. And then what? I arrive in some frontier town as a woman alone with no prospects, no family, and no husband. You know what that means? He did. A woman in her situation would be automatically suspect, either desperate enough to do anything for survival or morally corrupt enough to have ended up alone in the first place. Neither assumption would help her. You could wire your sister in Boston, he suggested, and beg her for train fare back east so I can spend the rest of my life being reminded of my failure? She shook her head. I'd rather take my chances here. Chances at what? I don't know yet. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw something other than shock or desperation in her expression. He saw determination. But I didn't travel 2,000 miles to give up after one day. Garrett found himself almost smiling. Almost. You're tougher than you look. I'd have to be. She stood, setting the empty coffee cup on the table. Thank you, Mr. Hale, for everything. Garrett. Garrett? She repeated it like she was testing the shape of his name. Thank you, Garrett. I'll repay you somehow. Get some sleep first. We'll talk in the morning. She nodded and moved toward the bedroom, then paused at the door. That thing you said earlier, about walking away versus running. I think you're right. There is a difference. What is it? When you run, you're always looking back. When you walk away, you're looking forward. She met his eyes. I'm trying to look forward, even if I don't know what I'm walking toward yet. Then she disappeared into the bedroom and closed the door softly. Garrett sat alone by the fire, listening to the storm and thinking about storms in general. The ones in the sky that killed crops and flooded rivers and left people stranded at crossroads, and the ones inside people, the kind that destroyed lives just as efficiently but left no visible damage. He'd spent 7 years trying to outrun his own storm. Built walls of isolation and hard work, convinced himself that wanting nothing meant risking nothing. Then a woman appeared out of the rain, hollow-eyed and abandoned, and something in Garrett's carefully constructed solitude cracked just enough to let light through. He didn't know what that meant yet, but he suspected his life had just gotten considerably more complicated. The storm broke sometime before dawn. Garrett woke to silence, the kind that felt loud after hours of thunder and wind. He'd slept poorly on the floor near the fireplace, his body reminding him he wasn't 20 anymore and roughing it had consequences. Gray light filtered through the windows. The fire had burned down to embers. Garrett stood, stretched, winced at the protest from his lower back, and went to assess the damage. Outside, the world looked washed clean. The rain had stopped, leaving behind mud and puddles that reflected the overcast sky. Garrett walked the property, checking for damage. A section of fence was down. Some shingles had blown off the barn roof. Nothing catastrophic, just the usual price of living where weather had teeth. When he returned to the cabin, Vivian was up. She'd started a fresh fire and was attempting to make coffee with the kind of careful attention that suggested she had no idea what she was doing, but refused to ask for help. "Morning," Garrett said. She turned, startled. In daylight, he could see her more clearly, younger than he'd first thought, with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. The kind of intelligent face that would have made her intimidating in a New York drawing room. Out here, covered in mud and wearing his oversized clothes, she just looked determined. "I was trying to make coffee," she admitted. "I may have failed." Garrett checked her work. She'd used about twice as much ground coffee as necessary and not enough water. The result would be thick enough to chew. "Next time use less grounds," he said, dumping it out and starting over. "Coffee's expensive, no point wasting it." "I'll remember." They ate a simple breakfast: bread, some preserved meat, eggs from the chickens Garrett kept near the barn. Vivian ate like someone who'd forgotten food existed until it was in front of her. "We should get your trunk," Garrett said, "before someone else finds it." "Is that likely?" "Maybe. This is frontier territory. People take what they can get." They saddled Duke and rode back to the crossroads. The trunk was still there, wet but intact. Nobody had touched it during the night. Garrett loaded it onto Duke's back, secured it with rope, and they headed back. Vivian was quiet during the ride. He could feel tension in how she sat, like being near the place she'd been abandoned brought everything back. "You don't have to see him," Garrett said. "See who?" "Crawford. You don't owe him a conversation." "I know. But you're going to anyway." She was quiet for a long moment. "I need to understand why." "Why does there need to be a why? Some men are just bastards." "Maybe. But I need to hear him say it." She paused. "I need to look him in the eye and confirm that I wasn't wrong about what happened, that he really did leave me there to die." Garrett understood that. The need to face the thing that hurt you instead of letting it live in your imagination where it grew teeth and claws. "When?" "Soon. Before I lose my nerve." They reached the cabin and unloaded the trunk. Vivian opened it carefully, sorting through wet clothes and damaged belongings with the kind of methodical calm that meant she was barely holding it together. The wooden box she'd saved, the one she'd chosen over everything else, sat on the table between them. "What's in there?" Garrett asked. Vivian looked at it for a long moment, then she opened the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, neatly tied with ribbon. Crawford's letters, the ones that had promised her a future. She pulled one out at random and read aloud. "My dearest Vivian, today I watched the sun set over the mountains and thought of you. Soon you will see these vistas yourself, and I hope they move you as deeply as they move me. I find myself counting the days until your arrival, imagining the life we will build together. A partnership of equals, two minds working toward a shared vision. I believe we will accomplish remarkable things." Her voice trailed off. She folded the letter carefully and put it back. "Beautiful lies," she said quietly. "Maybe not lies when he wrote them." "Does that make it better or worse?" Garrett didn't have an answer. She closed the box and stood. "I need to change. Then I need you to take me to the Crawford Ranch." "Today?" "Today. Before I talk myself out of it." An hour later, they were riding south. Vivian had changed into one of her own dresses, still damp, but better than Garrett's clothes. She'd done something with her hair, pulled it back in a way that made her look older, more severe. Battle armor, he realized. She was preparing for war. The Crawford Ranch was impossible to miss. It sprawled across a valley like a small town. Main house that looked more like a mansion, multiple barns, bunkhouses, corrals filled with horses. Money everywhere you looked. Garrett felt Vivian tense as they approached. A ranch hand met them at the gate. Young kid, probably 16, trying to look tough. "Help you?" "We're here to see Nathaniel Crawford," Vivian said. Her voice was steady, controlled. Mr. Crawford isn't receiving visitors. He'll see me. Tell him Vivian Mercer is here. The kid looked uncertain, but nodded and jogged toward the main house. They waited in silence. Garrett watched Vivian's face, saw her jaw tighten, saw her hands grip the saddle horn hard enough that her knuckles went white. "You don't have to do this," he said again. "Yes, I do." The kid came back. "Mr. Crawford will see you, in the study." They dismounted and followed him to the house. Inside was everything the cabin wasn't: polished wood, expensive furniture, paintings on the walls, the kind of wealth that announced itself loudly. Nathaniel Crawford waited in a room lined with books he'd probably never read. He was in his 40s, handsome in a soft way that came from never missing a meal or doing hard labor. When he saw Vivian, something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, more like inconvenience. "Miss Mercer." He didn't stand. "I'm surprised to see you." "Are you?" It wasn't a question. "I sent a telegram to the train station in Hartley, explaining that circumstances had changed." "I never received it." "That's unfortunate." He said it like someone commenting on bad weather. "But surely the situation was clear when no one met you." Vivian stood very still. "I waited at the crossroads for 7 hours, in a storm, believing you would come." "That seems unwise." Garrett felt rage flash through him, hot and immediate. The casual cruelty of it, the absolute lack of concern for whether this woman lived or died. He started to move forward, but Vivian's hand shot out, stopping him. "Why?" she asked Crawford. "Why what?" "Why spend 6 months writing letters? Why ask me to upend my entire life and travel across the country? Why promise a partnership if you never intended to honor it?" Crawford sighed like she was being difficult. "When I began our correspondence, I was sincere. But circumstances changed. My family made it clear that my marriage needed to serve certain purposes. Political connections. Social advancement. You're an educated woman, Miss Mercer, which I admired. But you bring no status, no family connections, no dowry of significance. So you traded me for a senator's daughter. I made a practical decision. Surely you understand practical decisions." Vivian absorbed this. Garrett watched emotions chase across her face: pain, anger, disbelief. But when she spoke, her voice was ice. "I understand that you are a coward. I understand that your word means nothing. And I understand that I had a remarkably lucky escape." Crawford's expression hardened. "You're disappointed. I sympathize. But you'll recover. Women always do." "Tell me something," Vivian said. "Did it ever occur to you that I might not survive being abandoned in the wilderness?" "You clearly did survive. Because a stranger showed more decency in 5 minutes than you showed in 6 months." She stepped closer. "You left me to die, Mr. Crawford. You knew there was a storm coming. You knew I had nowhere to go, and you simply didn't care. That's dramatic. It's the truth." Her voice cut through his. "You condemn me to death as casually as you'd discard a broken tool. Because that's all I was to you. A tool that stopped being useful." Crawford stood now, anger replacing his casual dismissal. "You came to my home. I've explained the situation. I owe you nothing more." "You're right." Vivian turned toward the door. "You owe me nothing, and I owe you even less." She walked out with her spine straight and her head high. Garrett followed, resisting the urge to put his fist through Crawford's face. Outside, Vivian made it to the horses before her composure cracked. She leaned against Duke, breathing hard, shaking. "That bastard," she whispered. "That absolute bastard." "Yeah." He didn't even apologize. Didn't even pretend to feel bad. Men like that don't apologize. They don't see other people as real enough to apologize to. Vivian looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Is everyone in Wyoming like him?" "No." Garrett said it firmly. "Most people out here are too busy surviving to be that cruel." She nodded, pulling herself together through visible effort. "Take me home." The word hit Garrett harder than expected. Home. She'd meant his cabin. She'd called it home without thinking. They rode back in silence. The afternoon sun was warm, drying the mud, making the prairie steam. By the time they reached the cabin, some of the tension had left Vivian's shoulders. She dismounted and stood looking at the simple structure. Rough wood, small windows, a home built for function, not beauty. "I'm staying," she said suddenly. What? Here, I'm staying here if you'll let me. Garrett stared at her. Vivian, I can work. I can cook, clean, help with the animals. I can learn anything I don't know. And I won't be a burden. I promise you that. It's not about being a burden. Then what is it about? She faced him. You said yourself that being a woman alone in town would destroy my reputation. But staying here, working as your housekeeper or ranch hand or whatever we call it, that could work, temporarily, until I figure out my next move. People will talk. People will talk anyway. At least this way I'll have a roof over my head while they do it. Garrett felt like he was standing at a cliff edge. One more step and everything changed. His carefully maintained isolation, his simple, solitary life, all of it would disappear the moment he said yes. But he looked at Vivian, strong despite being broken, determined despite being abandoned, and he couldn't say no. Temporary, he said finally, until you figure out what's next. Temporary, she agreed. Neither of them believed it. The first week was awkward. They moved around each other carefully, establishing routines and boundaries. Vivian took over cooking and cleaning with an efficiency that suggested she'd understated her domestic skills. She organized his chaotic supplies, mended clothes he'd been meaning to fix for months, and somehow made the cabin feel less like a cave and more like a home. In return, Garrett taught her the basics of ranch work: how to feed chickens without spooking them, how to check fence lines for damage, how to read weather signs and know when a storm was building. She learned fast, faster than he expected. You've done this before, Ma, he said one morning, watching her handle the chickens like she'd been raised on a farm. My grandparents had a small farm outside Albany. I spent summers there as a child. She smiled at the memory. My mother hated it, said I came back every year more wild than before. And you loved it. More than anything. So why New York? The smile faded. Because my mother died and my father needed me. Because society had expectations. Because being wild doesn't pay the bills or provide security. She paused. Until it turns out security was an illusion anyway. By the second week, the awkwardness had mostly faded. They fell into patterns that felt natural, Garrett working the land while Vivian managed the homestead, both of them exhausted by evening but satisfied in a way that came from honest work. By the third week, Garrett realized he'd stopped thinking of her presence as temporary. She was just there, part of the rhythm of his days. He'd catch himself listening for her voice, looking forward to evening meals where they'd talk about nothing important while the daylight faded. It scared him how quickly she'd become necessary. One evening, Vivian brought up Crawford again. Do you think he's told people what happened? Probably not. Men like that don't advertise their failures. I'm the failure in his version. Then his version is wrong. She looked at him across the dinner table. You're very certain about that. I am. You're the one who showed up. You're the one who had the courage to travel 2,000 miles for a promise. He's the one who broke his word and abandoned you. Garrett paused. You're not the failure, Vivian. You're the one who survived his cruelty. Her eyes went bright again, but she blinked it back. Thank you. It's just the truth. Maybe. But thank you for saying it anyway. The fourth week brought their first real test. A late summer storm rolled in, not as violent as the one that had brought them together, but sustained and brutal. 3 days of rain that turned the property into a swamp and made outdoor work impossible. They were trapped inside the cabin together, forced into proximity that revealed things isolation had hidden. Garrett learned that Vivian sang while she worked, quietly, songs he didn't recognize, her voice better than it had any right to be. She learned that Garrett read. Real books, not just almanacs and ranch journals. He had a small collection hidden in his bedroom, worn volumes of poetry and philosophy that he'd deny owning if anyone asked. You're not what I expected, she said on the third day, watching rain sheet past the windows. What did you expect? I don't know. A rough frontiersman who cared only about survival. Someone simple. Disappointed? Intrigued? She smiled slightly. Turns out people are complicated everywhere, even in Wyoming. Even in New York? Especially in New York. But there the complications are different, more performative. Here it feels like the complications are just human. They talked for hours that day, about their past, their failures, the versions of themselves they'd left behind. Vivian told him about her parents' death, her sister's betrayal, the slow erosion of everything she'd built in New York. Garrett told her about his father's violence, his mother's silence, the day he walked away from his family name and never looked back. By the time the storm cleared, they knew each other in ways that went deeper than weeks usually allowed. And Garrett realized, with something close to panic, that he was falling for her. Not the dramatic, sudden fall of romantic stories, but something slower, more inevitable, like erosion, like water wearing down stone. He didn't know what to do with that information, so he did nothing, kept working, kept his distance, kept pretending this was still temporary. Until the morning, Vivian planted flowers outside the cabin. It was a small thing. Wildflowers transplanted from the prairie, arranged near the front door in a way that was deliberately beautiful. Garrett stood watching her work, and something in his chest cracked wider. "Why?" he asked. She looked up, dirt on her hands, sunlight in her hair. "Because even temporary places deserve beauty." "Vivian, I know." She cut him off gently. "I know this isn't permanent. I know I need to figure out my real future. But while I'm here, I'm going to make it home." Garrett wanted to tell her it already was, that she'd made it home the moment she transformed his isolated cabin into a place worth returning to. Instead, he just nodded and went back to work. That night, for the first time, Garrett let himself imagine a future that included her. It terrified him, but it also felt like the first honest hope he'd had in years. The flowers lasted 3 days before the heat killed them. Vivian found them wilted one morning, their petals brown and curled like tiny fists. She stood looking at them for a long moment, then pulled them up and tossed them aside without comment. Garrett watched from the barn and said nothing. The frontier killed beauty as casually as it killed everything else. She was learning that now. But the next week she tried again. Different flowers this time, planted in shade with more water. These lasted longer. 6 weeks had passed since the storm. 6 weeks of Vivian transforming his homestead into something that felt less like survival and more like living. She'd organized the cabin until everything had a place. She'd started a small vegetable garden behind the house. She'd even convinced Garrett to fix the shutters that had been hanging crooked for 2 years. "They make the whole place look abandoned," she'd said. "The whole place is abandoned. It's just me out here." Not anymore. The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to examine too closely. Town became unavoidable eventually. They needed supplies, flour, salt, fabric for mending, things Garrett couldn't produce and couldn't do without. He'd been putting it off, knowing what would happen the moment people saw them together. "I should come with you," Vivian said when he mentioned the trip. "That's a bad idea." "Why?" "Because people will talk." "They're already talking. At least this way I can see who's doing it." She had a point. The isolation that had protected them couldn't last forever. Eventually, she'd need to exist in the world beyond his fence line. They rode into Hartley on a Thursday afternoon when the sun was high and mean. The town was small, one main street, a handful of businesses, enough people to support basic commerce, but not enough for anyone to mind their own business. Garrett felt eyes on them the moment they arrived. The general store was run by a woman named Martha Cunningham, 60 years old with opinions about everything and the social authority to make those opinions matter. When Garrett and Vivian walked in together, Martha's expression went from curious to knowing to disapproving in about 3 seconds. "Garrett," she nodded at him, then turned her attention to Vivian. "And who might this be?" "Vivian Mercer," Vivian said before Garrett could answer. She extended her hand like she was at a New York social function instead of a frontier general store. "Pleased to meet you." Martha looked at the offered hand like it might bite her, then shook it briefly. "Mercer. That name sounds familiar. I arrived about 6 weeks ago, from New York." "Ah, yes." Martha's tone sharpened. "You were supposed to marry Nathaniel Crawford, weren't you? I heard about that situation." Garrett felt Vivian tense beside him, but her voice stayed level. "That arrangement didn't work out." "I can imagine." Martha's eyes flicked between them. "And now you're staying with Garrett." "I'm working for him, managing his household in exchange for room and board." "Working for him." Martha repeated it slowly, loading the words with skepticism. "That's what we're calling it?" "That's what it is," Garrett said flatly. "You have a problem with how I run my property?" "No problem at all." But her expression said otherwise. "I just think it's interesting is all." A single woman living alone with a single man. People might get the wrong idea. Then people should mind their own business. This is a small town, Garrett. Nothing is private. They bought their supplies in tense silence. Martha tallied the costs with exaggerated precision, like she was doing them a favor by taking their money. When they left, Garrett could feel her watching through the window. That went well, Vivian said once they were outside. She's a gossip. Ignore her. Easy for you to say you're not the woman whose reputation just got shredded in about 5 minutes. Garrett loaded the supplies onto the wagon. Your reputation was already damaged when Crawford abandoned you. Living with me doesn't make it worse. Doesn't make it better either. They were halfway to the wagon when a man stepped into their path. Young, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Garrett recognized him immediately. Thomas Crawford, Nathaniel's younger brother. Miss Mercer. Thomas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. What a pleasant surprise. Vivian's expression went carefully neutral. Mr. Crawford, I heard you were still in the area, living with... He looked at Garrett. I'm sorry. I don't believe we've met. Garrett Hale. Ah, yes. The hermit rancher. My brother mentioned you. Thomas turned back to Vivian. I wanted to apologize on behalf of my family. Nathaniel's behavior was unconscionable, leaving you stranded like that. Your brother already explained his reasoning. Still, it wasn't gentlemanly. He paused, like he was considering something. If you find yourself in need of alternative arrangements, I'd be happy to help. My family has connections in town. We could find you suitable employment, perhaps as a teacher or... I have employment, Vivian said. Thomas glanced at Garrett, then back to her. Do you? How fortunate. The way he said it made Garrett's hands curl into fists, like he knew exactly what kind of employment Thomas was implying and found it amusing. We need to go, Garrett said. Of course. Thomas stepped aside, still smiling. But Miss Mercer, if you change your mind about those alternative arrangements, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'd hate to see someone of your obvious refinement trapped in a difficult situation. Vivian's jaw tightened. I'm not trapped, if you say so. They climbed onto the wagon and left. Garrett could feel Thomas watching them go, could imagine him already spreading his version of events to anyone who would listen. I shouldn't have come, Vivian said quietly. You had every right to come. That doesn't matter. Now, everyone knows I'm living with you, unmarried, unchaperoned. In a week, the whole territory will think I'm your mistress. Garrett didn't have a good response to that, because she was probably right. They rode in silence for a while. The afternoon heat pressed down like something solid. In the distance, thunder rumbled, another storm building, though still hours away. Maybe Thomas Crawford is right, Vivian said finally. Maybe I should look for different arrangements. You want to work for that family? After what they did to you? I want to survive with some shred of dignity intact. Working as their charity case won't give you dignity. Neither will being known as your whore. The word hit like a slap. Garrett pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her. Is that what you think people will say? It's what they're already saying. You heard Martha. I don't give a damn what Martha says. Well, I do. Her voice rose, frustration breaking through. You've lived out here for 7 years. You've built walls so thick nothing gets through. You don't care what people think because you don't need anyone. But I do. I need to exist in society. I need to be able to walk into town without people whispering. I need a future that doesn't involve being pitied or scorned. So what are you suggesting? She looked away. I don't know. I just know this isn't sustainable. The storm rumbled closer. Garrett could smell rain on the wind. When I found you at that crossroads, he said slowly, you were ready to die. You'd given up, but you survived. You came back stronger than before. Don't let a gossip like Martha Cunningham undo that. It's not about Martha. It's about reality. I can't live in limbo forever. Then stop living in limbo. What does that mean? Garrett didn't answer, because the words forming in his head were dangerous, the kind that changed everything and couldn't be taken back. Marry me. The thought hit him with sudden clarity. It was insane. They barely knew each other. 6 weeks wasn't enough time to build a marriage. But 6 weeks had been enough time to transform his entire existence, to make him want things he'd spent years denying. He couldn't say it, not yet, Not when the idea was still forming and terrifying. "Let's get home," he said instead, "before the storm hits." They didn't talk for the rest of the ride, but Garrett felt the weight of unsaid words pressing down heavier than the approaching thunder. The storm arrived just as they reached the cabin. This one was quick and violent, all flash and noise that ended within an hour. Afterward, the air smelled clean and the temperature had dropped to something almost comfortable. Vivian went about her evening routine, cooking dinner, tidying the cabin, doing the 100 small tasks that kept the household running. But Garrett could see tension in her shoulders, could sense her mind working through problems that had no easy solutions. They ate in near silence. The meal was good. Vivian had learned to cook over an open hearth with surprising skill, but neither of them tasted much. Finally, Garrett set down his fork. "We need to talk about this." "About what?" "Your future, our situation, all of it." Vivian looked up. In the lamplight, her face was shadowed, hard to read. "What's there to talk about?" "Options." "I don't have options, that's the problem." "Everyone has options, they're just not always good ones." He paused. "You could go back east, to your sister. We've been through this. You could take Thomas Crawford up on his offer, find work in town." "As what? A teacher who's living in sin with a rancher? No school board would hire me." "You could start over somewhere else, different territory, different name, different story. Running away, like you did." The words stung because they were true. "Yeah, like I did." Vivian stood and walked to the window, looking out at the wet prairie. "I don't want to run. I'm tired of running. I've been running since my parents died, from grief, from responsibility, from reality. I came west thinking it would be different, that I could build something real." She turned to face him. "And then I met you, and for 6 weeks I've been pretending this is sustainable, that I can just stay here indefinitely and everything will work out." "Maybe it will? How? How does this work, Garrett? You're a bachelor rancher living alone. I'm a woman with no family and a destroyed reputation. We can't just exist in this space between things forever." "Why not?" "Because society doesn't allow it. Because eventually something will force a decision, a bad harvest, an accident, gossip that gets too loud to ignore. And when that happens, we'll both pay the price." Garrett stood too. They faced each other across the small cabin, and he could feel the moment balanced on a knife edge. "There's another option," he said. "What?" "Marry me." The words landed in the space between them like stones. Vivian stared at him. "What?" "Marry me. Make this arrangement legal and permanent. Solve both our problems." "That's insane. Why?" "Because we barely know each other. Because marriage should be based on more than convenience. Because what? Because you're still hoping for love?" He didn't mean to sound harsh, but reality was harsh. "You tried that. With Crawford. With his beautiful letters and promises. How did that work out?" She flinched. "That's not fair." "It's true, though. Love didn't save you. A stranger dragging you out of a storm saved you. Hard work saved you. Building something real saved you. And you think marriage would save me now? I think it would give you security, legal protection, a place in society that's respectable instead of scandalous." He paused. "And I think it would give me a partner, someone who actually gives a damn about making this place work." Vivian shook her head. "This is crazy." "Maybe, but it's practical." "I don't want practical. I want—" She stopped herself. "What? What do you want?" "I don't know anymore." Her voice dropped. "When I came west, I wanted partnership, respect, someone who valued my mind as much as my ability to manage a household. Crawford promised all of that. And I'm not promising anything." "Exactly. You're proposing a business arrangement. I'm proposing survival, which is more honest than most marriages start with." She looked at him for a long moment. "And if I say yes, what happens then?" "We get married. You stay here legally. We work the ranch together. We build something that lasts." "Without love." "Without the illusion of love," he corrected. "We'd have respect, trust, common purpose. That's more than most people get." "That's incredibly sad." "That's realistic." Vivian turned back to the window. Outside, the moon was rising, painting the wet prairie silver. "I need time to think about this." "Take all the time you need." But they both knew time was running out. The longer she stayed unmarried, the worse the gossip would get. And in a place where reputation could mean the difference between survival and ruin, gossip mattered. 3 days passed. They moved around each other carefully, both aware of the unanswered question hanging between them. Garrett threw himself into ranch work, fixing things that didn't need fixing, checking fence lines he'd checked the week before. Anything to avoid sitting still and thinking about the fact that he'd proposed marriage to a woman he'd known for 6 weeks. Vivian maintained the household with her usual efficiency, but he could see her mind working. She was calculating odds, weighing options, trying to figure out which choice would hurt least. On the 4th day, she came to him while he was repairing the barn roof. "I'll do it," she said. Garrett looked down at her. "You sure?" "No, but I'm out of better ideas." "That's not exactly a ringing endorsement." "You asked for practical, not romantic." She crossed her arms. "I have conditions, though." "Such as?" "Separate bedrooms. This is a business arrangement, not a real marriage." "Fine. Equal partnership in ranch decisions. I'm not a servant or decoration." "Agreed. And if either of us wants out, if this doesn't work, we end it. No questions, no guilt." Garrett climbed down from the roof. Up close, he could see uncertainty in her eyes, but also determination. She was choosing the least bad option and making peace with it. "Agreed," he said. "Anything else?" "Just one thing." She met his eyes. "Be honest with me, always. I can handle hard truths. I can't handle beautiful lies." He thought about Crawford's letters, all those pretty promises that meant nothing. "I can do that." "Then we have a deal." They shook on it like business partners sealing a contract, which, Garrett supposed, they were. The wedding was set for the following Saturday. They kept it simple. Hartley's small church, a visiting circuit preacher, witnesses pulled from whoever happened to be in town that day. Garrett wore his only suit, a black wool thing he'd bought years ago and never had occasion to wear. It didn't fit quite right anymore, too tight across the shoulders from years of ranch work. Vivian wore a dress from her trunk. Not the finest one she'd mentioned before, but something simple and elegant in dark blue. She'd done something with her hair that made her look older, more serious. They looked like strangers playing dress-up. The church was mostly empty. Martha Cunningham sat in the front row with her husband, watching with an expression that suggested she was waiting for disaster. A few other townspeople had shown up, more out of curiosity than support. The preacher was an old man who'd seen enough frontier marriages to recognize this one for what it was. He kept the ceremony short and functional, skipping the flowery language about love and devotion. "Do you, Garrett Hale, take this woman as your lawful wife?" "I do." "Do you, Vivian Mercer, take this man as your lawful husband?" Vivian hesitated, just for a second, long enough that Garrett felt something cold settle in his chest. Then she said, "I do." "Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." No kiss, no celebration, just legal words that changed everything and nothing. They signed the certificate. The preacher filed it away. And just like that, Vivian Mercer became Vivian Hale. Outside, Martha approached them with a smile that didn't quite work. "Congratulations. I'm sure you'll be very happy together." "Thank you," Vivian said with equal insincerity. "It's good that Garrett finally has someone to help manage that isolated property. Must get terribly lonely out there." "We manage." "Still, marriage is about more than just managing, isn't it? It's about companionship, love, building a family." Garrett saw Vivian's jaw tighten. "We're building what works for us." "Of course, dear. I'm just saying, well, people will talk regardless, but at least now they can't question the legality of your arrangement." "How generous of them," Vivian said dryly. They escaped before Martha could offer more wisdom. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. When they arrived, nothing had changed. Same cabin, same barn, same endless prairie stretching to the horizon. Except everything had changed. Vivian went to her room, the bedroom Garrett had vacated weeks ago, and closed the door. He stood in the main room still wearing his too-tight suit and wondered what the hell he'd just done. They'd solved the practical problem. Vivian was now a respectable married woman instead of a scandalous house guest. The gossip would die down. Society would accept her. But standing alone in his cabin on his wedding night, Garrett felt more isolated than he had in 7 years of actual solitude. He changed out of the suit and went to check on the horses. because horses didn't require him to figure out complicated human emotions. When he came back an hour later, Vivian was making dinner like it was any other evening. She'd changed into work clothes. Her hair was down. Nothing about her suggested she'd just gotten married. "You hungry?" she asked. "Yeah." They ate in silence. The food was good. Everything was fine, perfectly, carefully, deliberately fine. "This is strange," Vivian said finally. "Which part?" "All of it. Being married. To you. To anyone." She paused. "This morning I was Vivian Mercer. Tonight I'm Vivian Hale. But I don't feel different." "Did you expect to?" "I don't know. Maybe." She looked at her wedding ring, a simple gold band Garrett had purchased that morning. Crawford talked about marriage like it was transformative, like saying vows would change everything. "And what did you learn?" "That words don't change anything. Actions do." Garrett turned that over in his mind. "You're right. So what now?" "Now we keep working, keep building, keep proving that this arrangement makes sense." "To who?" "To everyone who thinks we're making a mistake." Vivian smiled slightly. "That's a lot of people." "Then we have our work cut out for us." They fell back into their routines, but something had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained became harder to navigate. They were married now, which meant different social rules, different expectations. When they went to town the next week, people treated Vivian differently. Not warmly, this was still frontier society with all its judgment, but with grudging respect. Mrs. Hale had legitimacy that Miss Mercer never did. Vivian learned to ignore the whispers and knowing looks. She held her head high, paid for supplies with Garrett's money like she had every right to, and refused to apologize for existing. Garrett watched her adapt and felt something like pride. The ranch work intensified as summer faded toward fall. They had to prepare for winter, cutting hay, preserving food, reinforcing buildings against snow and wind. Vivian worked beside him through all of it, learning skills she'd never needed in New York. She learned to split wood without destroying her hands, learned to identify sick chickens before they infected the flock, learned to read the sky for storms and the land for water. "You're getting good at this," Garrett said one afternoon, watching her expertly mend a section of fence. "I had a good teacher." "I didn't teach you half of what you know." "No. Necessity taught me the rest." They worked well together. That was the surprising part. They'd fallen into a partnership that felt natural despite its artificial origins. Garrett made decisions about livestock and land management. Vivian handled finances and supplies. They consulted each other on major choices and trusted each other's judgment on small ones. It worked. But at night, when they retreated to separate rooms, Garrett lay awake wondering if practical success was enough. If building something functional meant they'd built something real. He didn't have answers. 2 months after the wedding, the first real test came. Garrett was working on the barn roof again. Different section, same basic repair, when his foot slipped on wet shingles. He fell 12 feet and landed badly. His leg twisted under him at an angle that made Vivian scream when she came running. The pain was immediate and absolute, white-hot agony that made the world disappear into a single point of suffering. "Don't move," Vivian said. She was kneeling beside him, hands hovering like she wanted to help, but didn't know how. "My leg's broken." He could barely get the words out. "I'll get help." "No time. Town's 2 hours away. We need to set it here." "I don't know how—" "Yes, you do." He gripped her hand hard. "You've read medical books. You're smart enough to figure it out, and I trust you." Fear flashed across her face, but she nodded. "Tell me what to do." He talked her through it. How to cut away his pant leg. How to feel for the break and determine if the bone had pierced skin. How to pull and align while he tried not to scream. It was brutal. The pain made him vomit twice. But Vivian's hand stayed steady, her voice calm even when tears ran down her face. "Almost done," she kept saying. "You're doing great. Just hold on." She splinted the leg using boards from the fence and strips torn from her apron. Then she got him inside, half carrying, half dragging him across the yard, and onto the bed. He passed out sometime during that process. When he woke, it was dark. His leg throbbed with every heartbeat, but the sharp agony had dulled to something survivable. Vivian sat in a chair beside the bed, watching him. "How long?" he managed. 4 hours. I wasn't sure if you'd wake up. Hard to kill. Apparently, she leaned forward. The leg's set, but you need a real doctor to check it. I'll ride to town tomorrow. You can't leave the ranch unattended. I can't leave you with a broken leg and no medical care. They argued about it for another hour before compromising. She'd go to town the next day, bring back the doctor, and they'd figure out next steps from there. The doctor came, a tired man named Harrison, who'd seen enough frontier accidents to be unsurprised, and confirmed that Vivian had set the bone correctly. You'll need to stay off it for at least 6 weeks, he told Garrett. Maybe longer. No weight, no walking, no nothing. That's not possible. Then you'll have a permanent limp. Your choice. Garrett looked at Vivian. 6 weeks of being useless while winter approached. 6 weeks of her handling everything alone. We'll manage, she said before he could argue. And somehow, she did. Vivian took over the ranch completely. She fed animals, checked fence lines, hauled water, chopped wood. She did the work of 2 people and made it look almost easy. Garrett watched from the cabin, frustrated and useless, while his wife proved she was stronger than anyone had given her credit for. You don't have to do this alone, he said one evening. Hire someone from town. With what money? We have some saved, which we need for winter supplies. I'm not spending it on labor I can provide myself. You're exhausted. I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. He could see it in how slowly she moved in the mornings, how her hands shook when she thought he wasn't looking, how she fell asleep over dinner more than once. She was destroying herself keeping the ranch running, and there was nothing Garrett could do except heal faster. 8 weeks after the accident, he finally put weight on the leg. It held. Dr. Harrison had been right about the limp. He'd carry that forever now, but at least he could walk. He found Vivian in the barn, feeding the horses. She looked up when he entered, and something crossed her face. Relief, maybe. Or just exhaustion. You're walking, she said. Limping, but yeah. Does it hurt? Not as bad as watching you work yourself to death. She turned back to the horses. Someone had to keep things going. I know, and you did. You kept everything running when I couldn't. He moved closer. I owe you. You don't owe me anything. This is what partners do. Partners. The word hit different now. They'd started as strangers, become housemates, married for convenience. But somewhere in the past weeks, they'd become actual partners. Garrett realized he didn't know when that shift had happened, only that it had. Vivian. She turned. Thank you. For what? For not giving up, on the ranch, on this arrangement, on me. Something softened in her expression. Where else would I go? Anywhere. You could have left while I was laid up, could have decided this was too hard. I could have, she agreed, but I didn't want to. The words hung between them, meaning more than they said. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow and temperatures that turned the prairie into something hostile. But the ranch was ready. They had supplies, repaired buildings, enough wood to last until spring. They'd made it through the first major test. And as Garrett sat by the fire one freezing December night, watching Vivian read by lamplight, he realized something that should have terrified him, but instead felt inevitable. He'd stopped thinking of this as a business arrangement. Somewhere between the practical proposal and the broken leg, between the town gossip and the brutal ranch work, something real had grown. He didn't love her. Not yet. But he could see it coming like weather on the horizon, unavoidable and transformative. And for the first time in 7 years, Garrett Hale wasn't afraid of what came next. The realization didn't announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly one January morning while Garrett watched Vivian argue with a stubborn chicken that refused to leave its nesting box. You can't stay in there all day, she was saying, completely serious. The other hens need their turn. The chicken made an indignant noise. I don't care if you're comfortable. Life isn't about comfort. Garrett leaned against the barn door, trying not to smile. 6 months ago, this woman had been sitting in expensive clothes at a muddy crossroads, waiting to die. Now she was lecturing poultry about work ethic. She finally got the chicken out and turned to find him watching. What? Nothing. You're smirking. I'm appreciating your negotiation skills. With a chicken. Still counts. She rolled her eyes, but he caught the small smile before she turned away. These moments had become more frequent. Casual touches that lingered, conversations that went deeper than necessary, silences that felt comfortable instead of awkward. They were slipping. Both of them knew it. The arrangement they'd built so carefully was developing cracks, and neither seemed particularly motivated to patch them. January gave way to February with temperatures that made the previous month look mild. The kind of cold that hurt to breathe, that turned metal brittle and made every task twice as hard. They spent most days inside, venturing out only for essential chores. Being trapped together should have been miserable. Instead, Garrett found himself looking for excuses to stay near her, helping with cooking when she didn't need help, reading aloud from books because she mentioned liking his voice, sitting closer than necessary by the fire because the cabin was cold, and body heat was practical. Practical. That word was doing heavy lifting lately. "Tell me about your family," Vivian said one evening. They'd finished dinner and were drinking coffee, both reluctant to end the day and retreat to separate rooms. Garrett tensed. "Not much to tell." "You walked away from them. That's something." "Walking away isn't the same as having a story worth telling. Try me." He stared into his cup, watching steam curl upward. Talking about his past felt like opening a wound that had finally scabbed over. But Vivian had shared her history, the dead parents, the estranged sister, the slow erosion of everything she'd built. Maybe he owed her the same honesty. "My father was a railroad man," he said finally. "Made good money, drank most of it, took his failures out on my mother and me. Standard story. Nothing special." "Did he hit you?" "When he remembered I existed." Vivian's expression shifted. Not pity, thank Christ, but understanding. "And your mother?" "Pretended everything was fine, even when it clearly wasn't. Even when neighbors asked questions, she'd smile and make excuses." Garrett paused. "I think she believed if she ignored the problems hard enough, they'd disappear." "They never do, though." "No, they just get bigger." He took a drink of coffee, using the motion to avoid her eyes. "When I turned 23, my father came home drunk and decided I'd looked at him wrong. We fought. I won. And I realized if I stayed, eventually one of us would kill the other. So you left." "Walked out that night with nothing but the clothes I was wearing. Worked railroad jobs for 2 years, saved every penny, came west and bought this land cheap from a widow who couldn't work it alone." "Do you ever think about going back?" "Never. Not even to see if your mother—" "She made her choice. I made mine." His tone came out harsher than intended. "Sorry, it's not a topic I revisit often." "I understand." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "My sister made a similar choice. After our parents died, the inheritance was supposed to be split evenly, but she convinced the lawyers I was unstable, grieving too hard, making poor decisions. She got control of everything and offered me a small allowance if I'd live quietly and not cause trouble." "And you told her to go to hell." "In more polite terms, but essentially yes." She smiled without humor. "We haven't spoken in 3 years. For all I know, she thinks I'm dead." "Would she care?" "Probably not." They sat with that shared understanding, the particular loneliness of being abandoned by blood family. It should have been depressing, but instead Garrett felt closer to her than ever. "We're a pair," he said, "broken pieces trying to build something functional. Is it working?" She looked at him directly. "I think so. Are we still pretending this is just a business arrangement?" The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward into everything they'd been avoiding. "I don't know what we're doing," Garrett admitted. "Neither do I. But it doesn't feel like business anymore." "What does it feel like?" Vivian opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Like maybe we accidentally built something real while we were trying to build something practical. And that scares you. Terrifies me. Because real things can hurt you. Business arrangements are safe." Garrett knew he should agree. Should pull back into the comfortable distance they'd maintained since the wedding. Instead, he heard himself say, "Maybe safe isn't what we need." "Then what do we need?" He didn't have an answer that wouldn't change everything, so he said nothing. But the question hung between them for the rest of the night. March brought the first hints of thaw. Snow melted into mud, the wind lost some of its bite, and life started showing signs of returning to the frozen prairie. Garrett's leg had healed enough that the limp barely registered anymore, and the ranch had survived winter intact. They'd done it, made it through the hardest season with the partnership not just surviving, but stronger. The success should have felt like victory. Instead, Garrett felt restless in a way he couldn't name. "We should expand," Vivian said one morning over breakfast. Expand what? The ranch. We have enough saved now. We could buy more cattle, increase the herd, maybe add sheep. There's good money in wool. Garrett considered this. She was right about the finances. They'd been careful, and Vivian's management of their accounts had revealed profits he hadn't known existed. That's ambitious. You have a problem with ambition? No. Just surprised to hear it from someone who called this temporary 6 months ago. She met his eyes. Maybe I changed my mind about temporary. Maybe? Definitely. I changed my mind definitely. She stood, started clearing dishes. Unless you want me to leave. I don't? Then we're expanding. They rode into Hartley the next week to talk with the bank about a loan. The same banker who'd denied Garrett's extension months ago sat across from them now, looking between their determined faces and the carefully prepared financial documents Vivian had brought. This is quite impressive, Mrs. Hale, he said, studying the numbers. Your husband's operation has become significantly more profitable under your guidance. Under our partnership, Vivian corrected, we make decisions together. The banker's expression suggested what he thought about wives having opinions, but he was too professional to say it. The bank would be willing to extend credit based on these projections, with appropriate collateral, of course. The land itself serves as collateral, Garrett said. And if the expansion fails, it won't. You seem very confident for a venture that involves considerable risk. Vivian leaned forward. Mr. Patterson, my husband and I have survived a deadly storm, a broken leg that should have destroyed the ranch, and a winter that killed 3 of our neighbors' operations. We're not afraid of risk. We're afraid of standing still. Patterson blinked at her directness. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. Very well. The bank will approve the loan. Welcome to the cattle business, Mrs. Hale. They left with financing and a timeline. By summer, they'd double their herd. By fall, they'd be one of the larger operations in the territory. That was well done, Garrett said as they rode home. Which part? Standing up to Patterson, he tried to dismiss you and you shut it down. Men like that always try to dismiss women. You just have to make it harder than it's worth. She paused. You weren't bothered that I spoke for us? Why would I be? Some men would consider it overstepping. Some men are idiots. You're better with numbers and negotiations than I am. Why wouldn't you speak? He said it casually, but he saw impact flash across her face, like he'd handed her something valuable without realizing it. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For meaning that. The expansion kept them busy through spring. They purchased cattle from 3 different ranchers, negotiated prices that made Vivian gleeful and the sellers grumpy, and transported everything back to their land. The work was brutal, long days of moving livestock, repairing fences to accommodate larger numbers, setting up new grazing rotations. But they were building something, growing something, and every successful day felt like proof that their gamble had been worth it. One afternoon in May, they were working together to move a particularly stubborn bull when Thomas Crawford appeared on horseback at their property line. Hale, he called out. Might I have a word? Garrett's jaw tightened. He'd successfully avoided the Crawford family for months and preferred to keep it that way. But Vivian was already walking toward the fence, so he followed. Mr. Crawford, she said coolly. Mrs. Hale, you're looking well. Ranch life clearly agrees with you. Was there something you wanted? Thomas smiled that same knowing smile Garrett wanted to punch off his face. I came to make an offer, actually. My family is interested in purchasing your land. Garrett laughed. Not for sale. You haven't heard the price yet. Doesn't matter. We're not interested. I'm authorized to offer considerably above market value, enough that you could buy a larger property elsewhere, with money left over. Why would your family want this land? Vivian asked. It's small, remote, and until recently, barely profitable. Expansion plans of our own, and we prefer to buy out neighbors before they become competitors. Thomas looked directly at Garrett. I'm being generous here. Take the offer while it's available. The answer is no. You should discuss it with your wife before making hasty decisions. I agree with my husband, Vivian said. We're not selling. That's short-sighted. You're one bad season away from losing everything anyway. Garrett felt anger spike hot and immediate. Get off my property. Our property, Vivian corrected softly. She turned to Thomas. Tell your family we're not interested in selling now or ever. And if they send you back with threats disguised as offers, my husband won't be so polite next time." Thomas's smile finally faded. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe, but it's our mistake to make." He rode off without another word. Garrett watched until he disappeared over the ridge, then turned to Vivian. "You didn't have to back me up like that." "Why wouldn't I? This is our land, our work. No one gets to intimidate us off it." "The Crawfords have resources we don't. If they want this property, they'll find ways to make our lives difficult." "Let them try." Her expression was fierce. "I didn't survive being abandoned and nearly dying just to give up the first time someone wealthy waves money at me." Garrett felt something shift in his chest. Pride, maybe. Or recognition that the frightened woman from the crossroads had become someone formidable. "What?" Vivian asked, catching his expression. "Nothing. Just thinking you've changed since that first night." "So have you." "How?" "You smile now. Sometimes. It's subtle, but it's there." She was right. He hadn't realized it, but the constant weight he'd carried for years felt lighter. Like somewhere in building a partnership, he'd accidentally built a life worth living. The Crawford visit gnawed at Garrett over the following weeks. He didn't trust Thomas's casual delivery or the family's sudden interest. People like that didn't make generous offers out of kindness. He started paying closer attention to property lines, checking for signs of encroachment or sabotage. Nothing appeared wrong, but the unease persisted. "You're worrying," Vivian observed one evening. "I'm being cautious." "About what?" "Thomas made an offer. We declined. That's the end of it." "Maybe. Or maybe you're looking for problems because things are going well and you don't trust good fortune." That stung because it was accurate. "Can you blame me?" "No, but I can remind you that we've earned this. The ranch is doing well because we work hard and make smart decisions, not because of luck. And if the Crawfords decide to push back, then we push harder." Her confidence should have been reassuring. Instead, it made Garrett more nervous. Vivian had never dealt with people like the Crawfords, the kind who viewed other people's success as personal insults requiring correction. He was proven right 3 weeks later. Garrett rode out to check the northern fence line and found an entire section destroyed. Not weather damage. Someone had deliberately cut the wire and scattered posts. About 20 head of cattle had wandered through onto Crawford land. His blood went cold. By the time he rode back to get Vivian, his mind was working through scenarios, all of them bad. "They sabotaged our fence, and now they have our cattle," Vivian said, reading the situation immediately. "That's one interpretation. What's the other?" "That our cattle wandered onto their land through a fence that coincidentally failed, and now we have to pay trespass fees or forfeit the animals." Vivian's expression went hard. "That's theft. That's legal gray area, and the Crawfords are good at exploiting gray areas. So what do? We go get our cattle back. And if they won't give them up, then things get complicated." They rode to the Crawford ranch together, Garrett acutely aware that bringing Vivian might be a mistake. But leaving her behind felt worse, like he was protecting her from battles that affected them both equally. Nathaniel Crawford himself met them this time. Older than Thomas, with the same soft handsomeness but more authority. This was the man who'd written those letters, who'd promised Vivian a future and then discarded her without a second thought. Garrett felt Vivian go rigid beside him. "Mr. and Mrs. Hale," Nathaniel said smoothly. "To what do I owe this visit?" "You have our cattle," Garrett said flatly. "Ah, yes, about that. Your livestock wandered onto my property through a damaged fence. I've had my men pen them for safekeeping." "How generous. We'll take them back now." "I'm afraid there's the matter of trespass fees, and the cost of my men's labor in rounding them up. Shall we say $200? It was an outrageous amount, 3 times what the cattle were worth. "That's robbery," Vivian said. Nathaniel's attention shifted to her for the first time. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Mrs. Hale, you're looking well. Marriage clearly suits you better than I expected." "Don't speak to her," Garrett said. "I'm simply making an observation. When last we met, she was considerably more distressed." Vivian's hands were shaking, but her voice stayed level. "When last we met, you explained that I lacked sufficient status to be worth keeping promises to. Has your position on that changed?" "Not particularly, though I must admit marrying a small-time rancher was a creative solution to your predicament. Creative or not, it's my life now, and you have our cattle, which I'm happy to return for appropriate compensation. The fence was sabotaged, Garrett said. We both know it. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof? I have wire that was cut deliberately. Or that failed due to poor maintenance. Hard to say without an official inspection. Nathaniel smiled. Tell you what, to avoid unpleasantness, I'll reduce the fee to $100. Take the offer, or I sell the cattle to cover my costs. Garrett did the math quickly. $100 was money they needed for other things, but losing the cattle meant losing more in the long run. Fine, he said through clenched teeth. 100. Excellent. I'll have my men bring them to the property line tomorrow. Cash payment, of course. They rode home in furious silence. Vivian's face was pale. Her jaw set so tight Garrett worried she'd crack teeth. I'm sorry, he said finally. For what? For making you see him again. I should have gone alone. So he could rob you without me there to witness it? No. She took a shaky breath. I needed to see him anyway. Needed to confirm that the man who wrote those letters never actually existed. Vivian, he looked at me like I was nothing, like I was less than nothing, some embarrassing mistake he'd almost made. You're not nothing. I know that now. But for a moment, standing there while he smiled that superior smile, I felt exactly like the woman sitting at the crossroads waiting to die. Garrett reached over and took her hand. She gripped it hard enough to hurt. You're not that woman anymore, he said. You're the woman who rebuilt a ranch while I was laid up, who stood up to a banker and got us financing, who just faced the man who tried to destroy her and didn't break. I wanted to break, but you didn't. That's what matters. She held his hand the rest of the way home. That night, Garrett lay awake thinking about the Crawfords and their calculated cruelty. The sabotaged fence was just the beginning. People like that didn't stop until they got what they wanted or someone made them stop. He heard movement from Vivian's room, soft footsteps, then her door opening. She appeared in his doorway, wrapped in a blanket. Can't sleep? No. Me either. She hesitated. Can I stay in here? Just to talk? Yeah. She settled into the chair by his bed, pulling the blanket tighter. In the dim moonlight, she looked young and exhausted and determined all at once. Thank you, she said, for today, for standing beside me instead of trying to protect me from it. You're my partner. That means we face things together. Even when it's painful? Especially then. Vivian was quiet for a moment. When I agreed to marry you, I thought I was trading one form of survival for another. Security in exchange for freedom. But that's not what this is it? What is it? I don't know. Something more complicated. Something that keeps changing shape. Garrett sat up, ignoring the protest from his leg. You want the truth? Always. I didn't expect to care about you. This was supposed to be practical, solving problems for both of us. But somewhere between the wedding and now, I started caring, and that scares the hell out of me. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Why does it scare you? Because caring means vulnerability, means giving someone the power to hurt you. Like your father hurt you. Yeah, I'm not your father, Garrett. I know that. Do you? Because you keep me at arm's length even when we're in the same room, like you're waiting for me to prove I'll betray you eventually. The accusation stung because it was true. He'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop since the day they met, waiting for Vivian to realize she'd made a mistake and leave. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to be married to someone I actually care about. Neither do I. But maybe we figure it out together. What if we can't? What if I'm too damaged and you're too hurt and we just keep failing at it? Then we fail together. She stood and moved closer. But I don't think we're failing. I think we're terrified of succeeding. She was right. They'd both spent so long expecting the worst that actual happiness felt suspicious, like something that would be taken away the moment they acknowledged it. Vivian reached out and touched his face. Her hand was warm, steady. I care about you too. I've been fighting it for months because it wasn't part of the plan, but I'm tired of fighting. Vivian, let me finish. I know we agreed to separate rooms to keep this practical, but I don't want practical anymore. I want real. Even if real is messy and complicated and scary. Garrett covered her hand with his. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe we stop pretending this is just a business arrangement. Maybe we admit we've built something that matters. And if it falls apart, then at least we tried. He pulled her closer, slowly enough that she could pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Instead, she leaned in, and when their lips met, it felt like something settling into place. Not fireworks or dramatic passion, just rightness. Like coming home after a long journey to find the door unlocked and the fire burning. They stayed like that for a long moment. When they finally pulled apart, Vivian was smiling. Well, she said, that changes things. Yeah. What do we do now? Garrett thought about the Crawfords and their schemes, about the ranch that needed constant work, about all the practical concerns that demanded attention. Then he decided practical could wait. Now, he said, we figure out what we actually want instead of what we think we should want. And what do you want? You, this, whatever we're building together. Even though it's terrifying, especially because it's terrifying, means it's real. Vivian settled beside him on the bed, her head resting against his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence while moonlight painted shadows across the walls. We're going to be okay, she said eventually. How do you know? Because we've survived everything else. Storm, scandal, broken legs, sabotaged fences. The Crawfords think they can break us, but they don't understand what we're made of. What are we made of? Stubbornness and spite and something that refuses to quit even when quitting makes sense. Garrett laughed. It felt good. That's one hell of a foundation. It's kept us upright so far. They fell asleep like that, not in separate rooms maintaining careful distance, but together in a tangle of limbs and blankets that suggested permanence. When Garrett woke to find her still there, sunlight streaming through the window and her hand intertwined with his, he felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest. Hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind that came from having no other options, but the dangerous kind that came from actually believing in a future worth building. He was still terrified, but for the first time in his adult life, terror felt like something worth facing instead of running from. Vivian stirred, opened her eyes, smiled at him like waking up together was the most natural thing in the world. Morning, she said. Morning. So this is happening? Yeah. This is happening. Good. She stretched, cat-like and satisfied. Because I have plans for this ranch, and they work a lot better with you actively participating instead of brooding in corners. I don't brood. You absolutely brood, but I find it oddly charming. Charming. Don't let it go to your head. They got up and started the day's work. But something had fundamentally shifted. The careful distance was gone, replaced by touches that lingered and conversations that acknowledged what they'd both been avoiding. They were married. Actually married. Not just legally or practically, but in the ways that mattered. And as spring gave way to early summer, as the ranch continued growing and the Crawfords plotted their next move, Garrett found himself thinking about the woman he'd found at a muddy crossroads. She'd been hollow-eyed and abandoned, ready to accept whatever fate delivered. Now she was fierce and determined, building an empire from spite and stubbornness. He'd saved her life that stormy night, but somehow, in the months since, she'd saved his right back. The change between them didn't announce itself with grand gestures. It showed up in smaller ways, Garrett's hand finding the small of Vivian's back as they worked, her coffee cup appearing beside his each morning without asking, the way they'd started finishing each other's sentences without noticing. But the Crawfords noticed. 2 weeks after the fence incident, Martha Cunningham appeared at their door with a basket of preserves and barely concealed curiosity. I was in the area, she said, though their ranch was an hour from anything resembling the area. Thought I'd check how you're settling in, Mrs. Hale. Vivian accepted the basket with practiced politeness. That's very kind. Would you like coffee? I wouldn't want to impose. It's no imposition. Martha settled at their table like she'd been invited to stay all day. Her eyes cataloged everything. The recently mended curtains, the organized kitchen, the small touches that made the cabin feel lived in rather than just occupied. You've done wonders with the place, Martha said. Garrett's lived here 7 years and never bothered with half these improvements. I like making spaces comfortable. A woman's touch certainly helps. Martha accepted the coffee Vivian poured. I heard you had some trouble with the Crawfords. Cattle on their land? So that's why she came. Garrett leaned against the door frame, watching Vivian navigate the conversation. Offense failed, Vivian said neutrally. These things happen. Of course. Though it's interesting how often these things seem to happen to people the Crawfords take an interest in. Martha sipped her coffee. The Johnsons had similar problems last year, lost half their herd to accidents before they finally sold out. We're not selling. I didn't think you would. You strike me as the stubborn type. Martha smiled. I mean that as a compliment, dear. Frontier life requires stubbornness. Garrett watched Vivian assess whether Martha was actually being friendly or gathering information to spread later. Probably both. The ranch is doing well, Vivian said carefully. We're expanding, actually. So I heard, quite ambitious for newlyweds. We believe in the property's potential. And each other's, I hope. Martha's tone turned pointed. Marriage built on business sense alone tends to crumble when the business hits trouble. Good thing ours isn't built on business sense alone, then. Martha's eyebrows rose. No? Vivian glanced at Garrett, something warm in her expression. No. The moment stretched between them, and Garrett felt exposed in a way he usually hated. But Martha's expression shifted from nosy to almost approving. Well, she said, standing, I'm glad to hear it. You two have been the subject of considerable gossip, as I'm sure you know. Nice to see you're actually making it work. After Martha left, Vivian turned to Garrett. That was unexpected. What part? Her almost being supportive at the end. She's a gossip, but she's not cruel. Probably just wanted to verify we weren't as scandalous as people assumed. And are we? Garrett pulled her close. Definitely, but not the way they think. She laughed against his chest. We should get back to work before you distract me further. Who says I'm the distraction? Please. You've been finding excuses to touch me all morning. You're complaining? Absolutely not, just stating facts. They worked through the afternoon repairing the damaged fence line. Garrett couldn't help noticing how naturally they moved together now, anticipating what the other needed, working in comfortable rhythm that came from actual partnership rather than forced cooperation. Hand me the wire cutters, Vivian said without looking up. He passed them over. You're getting good at this. I've had practice. Someone keeps letting fences fall apart. That was one time. And a broken leg and that winter storm. And, all right, point made. He secured a post while she stretched new wire. You know you don't have to do all this. I could hire help. With what money? We sunk everything into the expansion. We could take another loan. Or I could just do the work myself and save us the debt. She twisted the wire tight with practiced efficiency. Besides, I like it. Makes me feel useful. You are useful. I know, but there's a difference between being useful in theory and feeling it in your muscles at the end of the day. Garrett understood that completely. The satisfaction of hard work that left physical evidence, sore hands, tired body, tangible results. City life had never offered that kind of concrete accomplishment. They finished the fence as the sun started dropping toward the horizon. Vivian stood back, surveying their work with her hands on her hips. Think it'll hold. Better than the last one. That's not saying much if the Crawfords sabotaged it. Fair point. She turned to him, serious now. They're going to keep coming at us, aren't they? Probably. Because we won't sell? Because we're competition now. And because people like that can't stand when someone they've written off actually succeeds. Vivian nodded slowly. Then we need to be smarter, more careful. Stop reacting to their moves and start anticipating them. You have a plan? Working on one. But first I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. She paused. How big is the Crawford operation? Maybe 10 times our size. More land, more cattle, more money. But they're spread thin. Managing that much property takes resources. And from what I've heard, Nathaniel isn't as good at it as his father was. So they're vulnerable. Maybe. But that makes them more dangerous, not less. Desperate people do stupid things. Like sabotage fences? Like a lot worse than that if they decide we're a real threat. Vivian absorbed this information with the calculating expression she got when working through problems. Garrett had learned to recognize that look. It usually preceded her coming up with solutions he wouldn't have considered. "We need allies," she said finally. "In Hartley? Good luck. Most people avoid choosing sides when the Crawfords are involved. Not in town. Other ranchers. Small operations like ours that the Crawfords have probably pressured or pushed around." Garrett considered this. "You want to organize them? I want to create a united front. Make it clear that coming after one of us means dealing with all of us. That could work, or it could paint a bigger target on our backs. We already have a target. At least this way we'd have backup." She was right, and the strategy was sound. But Garrett couldn't shake the feeling they were escalating a situation that might be better left alone. "Let's think on it," he said. "Talk to a few people quietly. See if there's interest before we commit to anything." Agreed. Vivian started gathering tools. "In the meantime, we should vary our routine. Make it harder for anyone watching to predict when we're vulnerable." "You think they're watching?" "I think it would be stupid to assume they're not." They walked back to the cabin in the gathering dusk. The prairie was painted in orange and purple, beautiful in the way harsh places could be when the light hit right. Garrett found himself noticing it more lately, the beauty he'd stopped seeing somewhere in the years of just surviving. Vivian had done that too, made him see his own life differently. Inside, she started dinner while Garrett tended the fire. They'd fallen into these domestic patterns so naturally, he sometimes forgot they hadn't always existed, forgot that 9 months ago he'd lived alone and preferred it that way. "My sister wrote to me," Vivian said suddenly. Garrett looked up. "When?" "Letter came last week. I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure how I felt about it." "What did she say?" "That she heard I'd gotten married. That she hoped I was well. That perhaps we could reconcile now that enough time had passed." Vivian stirred the pot with more force than necessary. She included a bank draft, $500, like money fixes everything. "Are you going to write back?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to send the money back and tell her exactly what she can do with her guilt. But another part thinks maybe she's genuinely trying." "What does your gut say?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. "That she's trying to ease her conscience, not actually make amends. That she still thinks I'm the one who needs saving rather than acknowledging she's the one who did damage." "Then trust your gut, even if it means closing that door permanently." "Especially then. You don't owe her forgiveness just because she's family." Vivian set down the spoon and turned to face him. "Is that what you tell yourself about your father?" The question landed harder than she probably intended. "Yeah, that's exactly what I tell myself." "And does it work?" "Most days." "What about the other days?" Garrett didn't answer right away. The honest response required admitting things he usually kept buried. But they'd promised honesty, and Vivian had earned truth even when it was uncomfortable. "Other days I wonder if I'm just as damaged as he was. If walking away was strength or cowardice. If I'm capable of being better, or if I'm just one bad day away from becoming him." "You're nothing like him." "You don't know that." "I do." She crossed to him, taking his hands. "I've seen you angry. I've seen you frustrated and hurt and pushed to your limits. And not once have you lashed out. Not once have you made your problems someone else's pain." "That doesn't mean I couldn't. It means you choose not to, every single day. That's not damage, Garrett. That's character." He wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that the deliberate choices he made to be different actually mattered. But decades of his father's voice in his head made that acceptance difficult. "Your sister doesn't deserve forgiveness if she hasn't actually changed," he said, shifting focus back to safer ground. "And you don't owe her peace of mind at the cost of your own." Vivian nodded slowly. "I'll send the money back, with a letter explaining why." "You don't have to explain anything. I want to. For me, not for her. So I know I said what needed saying." She returned to cooking, and Garrett went back to the fire. But something had shifted. They'd exposed raw places to each other, trusted the other not to press on wounds. That kind of vulnerability was terrifying. It was also the foundation of something that might actually last. They ate dinner in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Afterward, Vivian worked on the ranch accounts while Garrett read. The lamplight made the cabin feel warm and contained, a small sphere of safety against the dark prairie beyond. "The numbers look good," Vivian said eventually. "Better than good, actually. If we have a solid fall, we'll be ahead of projections. That's assuming the Crawfords don't sabotage anything else." Even accounting for potential sabotage, we're in good shape. She closed the ledger with satisfaction. We might actually pull this off. Never doubted it. Liar. You doubted it constantly the first 3 months. Fine. I doubted it, but you never did. Someone had to believe. She stood and stretched. I'm exhausted. Coming to bed? The casual way she said it, like sharing a bed was now their normal routine, made Garrett smile. Yeah, let me bank the fire. In the bedroom that had once been his alone and was now theirs, Vivian changed into a nightgown, while Garrett stripped down to undershorts. The intimacy of it still felt new, but less terrifying than it had initially. They settled into bed, and Vivian immediately curled against him like she'd been doing it for years instead of weeks. Tell me something, she said into the darkness. About what? Anything. I just want to hear your voice. So Garrett told her about the day he'd bought this land, how he'd stood on this exact spot and imagined building something permanent, how he'd been lonely but convinced himself isolation was strength, how 7 years had passed in a blur of work and weather and willful blindness to what he was actually feeling. And then? Vivian prompted when he paused. And then a stubborn woman with terrible timing appeared in a storm and ruined everything. Ruined or improved? Improved. Definitely improved. She kissed him, slow and sweet. Good answer. They made love with the ease of people learning each other's rhythms. Not perfect. They were still figuring things out, still discovering what worked, but honest and present and enough. Afterward, lying tangled together while their breathing settled, Garrett felt something close to contentment. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of someone worth facing problems beside. I love you, Vivian said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Garrett's immediate instinct was to deflect or make a joke. Years of protecting himself had made vulnerability feel dangerous, but she deserved better than his fear. I love you too, he said. Probably have for a while. Just took me time to admit it. Was it so hard to admit? Terrifying, actually. Why? Because love gives people power over you, and I've spent a long time making sure nobody had that power. Vivian propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him. And now? Now I'm choosing to be terrified and love you anyway. That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Really? That's pathetic. Or maybe I just have low standards. She grinned. Kidding. It was perfect because it was honest. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other. Windows open to let in the cool night air. Outside, the prairie was quiet except for wind and distant animal sounds. Inside, two people who'd started as strangers had become something neither had expected. The next morning brought the first real test of their united front. Garrett was checking the southern fence line when he spotted smoke. Not wildfire. The column was too controlled, too deliberate, coming from the Crawford property near their shared border. His stomach dropped. He rode hard back to the cabin and found Vivian already outside, shading her eyes against the sun as she watched the smoke. That's not an accident, she said when he dismounted. No. What are they burning? Don't know, but it's right on the property line. Could be trying to smoke us out or damage our grazing land. Do we have time to stop it? Garrett assessed the wind direction. Maybe. If we move fast. They grabbed tools and rode toward the smoke. As they got closer, Garrett realized what the Crawfords were doing. They'd set fire to a massive pile of brush and deadwood right against the fence line. The flames weren't out of control yet, but the heat and smoke were driving cattle away from good grazing land. 3 Crawford ranch hands stood watching the fire. One of them, a kid Garrett recognized from town, looked uncomfortable. The other 2 seemed to be enjoying themselves. Morning, one of them called out. Nice day for a burn, don't you think? You're on the property line, Garrett said evenly. We're on Crawford land, perfectly legal to clear brush. In the middle of summer, when fire danger is highest? The ranch hand shrugged. Boss said to clear it. We're clearing it. Vivian dismounted and walked closer to the fence. You're creating a hazard that affects our land. That's actionable. Take it up with Mr. Crawford, ma'am. Oh, I will. But first, you're going to put this fire out. The ranch hand laughed. And why would we do that? Because if you don't, and it spreads to our property, you'll be personally liable for damages, all 3 of you. Vivian pulled out a small notebook, the one she used for ranch accounts, and a pencil. I'm documenting this. Time, location, your names. When this goes to court, I'll have everything recorded. The uncomfortable kid shifted. We were just following orders. Following illegal orders doesn't protect you from consequences. Vivian met his eyes. You seem smarter than your friends. Maybe consider if this job is worth potential jail time. Garrett watched his wife face down 3 men twice her size and felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly knocked him over. She wasn't backing down, wasn't intimidated, was using law and logic like weapons. Listen, lady, one of the ranch hands started. Mrs. Hale, Vivian corrected sharply. And you're dismissed. Go back to your employer and tell him his intimidation tactics aren't working. The 3 men exchanged looks. The uncomfortable kid was already edging toward his horse. After a moment, the other 2 followed. They rode off without putting out the fire, but at least they were gone. That was impressive, Garrett said. That was stupid and risky, and I'm shaking so hard I might fall over. You didn't look scared. I was terrified. But I was also furious, and fury is more useful than fear. They spent the next hour creating a fire break and making sure the flames didn't spread. The fire eventually burned itself out, leaving a scorched patch of earth that would be useless for grazing for months. This is just the beginning, Vivian said, looking at the damage. Yeah. They're going to keep escalating until we either sell or fight back hard enough that it's not worth the trouble, or until someone gets hurt. Vivian turned to him. Then we make sure it's not us. They rode back to the cabin, and Vivian immediately started writing letters to other small ranchers in the area, explaining the situation and proposing a meeting. To the territorial marshal, documenting the harassment. To a lawyer in Cheyenne she'd corresponded with about property rights. Garrett watched her work with methodical intensity, building a case like she was constructing a fence, one careful piece at a time until it was strong enough to hold. You're good at this, he observed. At what? Strategy, planning, turning anger into action. My father was a lawyer. I grew up watching him build cases. She sealed another envelope. He always said the best defense was documentation. Make everything official, create a paper trail, force people to confront their actions in writing. Think it'll work? Against the Crawfords? Maybe. They're used to bullying people into submission, not dealing with actual legal consequences. Over the next 2 weeks, responses came back. 4 other ranchers agreed to meet. The territorial marshal promised to investigate. The lawyer offered to review their documentation for a reasonable fee. It wasn't much, but it was something. The meeting happened on neutral ground, the back room of Hartley's General Store, rented for the occasion. The 4 ranchers who showed up were men Garrett knew by reputation, but had never worked with closely. Vivian led the meeting with confidence that suggested she'd done this before. She laid out the situation clearly. The harassment, the sabotage, the escalating intimidation. Then she proposed a mutual defense agreement. If the Crawfords came after one of them, the others would provide support. Witnesses, documentation, physical help if needed. Why should we risk Crawford's anger, one rancher asked. We've been keeping our heads down, staying out of trouble. And how's that working? Vivian countered. Are you expanding, growing, or just barely surviving while the Crawfords swallow up everyone around you? Survival is still success out here. Survival isn't enough. Not when you could be building something that lasts. Another rancher, older, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen hard times, spoke up. The lady's right. I lost half my land to Crawford intimidation 5 years ago. Wish I'd had people willing to stand with me back then. It's different now, the first rancher argued. The Crawfords are more aggressive. Fighting back could make things worse. Things are already worse, Garrett said. They're not going to stop taking until there's nothing left to take. We either push back together or get picked off one by one. The discussion continued for another hour. By the end, they had commitments from 3 of the 4 ranchers. Not a huge victory, but enough to start building something. Walking home afterward, Vivian was energized despite the long day. That went better than I expected. You were impressive in there. I just said what needed saying. Most people can't do that. They dance around uncomfortable truths or try to make everyone happy. You went straight at it. Life's too short for dancing around things. She paused. My father used to say the most dangerous person in any negotiation is someone with nothing left to lose. The Crawfords think they've pushed us to that point. They don't realize we've built something worth fighting for. Garrett took her hand. When did you become so fierce? Probably around the time I got abandoned at a crossroads and decided dying quietly wasn't acceptable. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Inside, Garrett started the fire while Vivian made dinner. The routine was so familiar now, it felt like it had always existed. Over the meal, they discussed next steps. The marshal's investigation, the lawyer's review, the alliance with other ranchers. Plans built on plans, each designed to make them stronger and more difficult to dislodge. Do you ever wish we had just taken the Crawford offer? Garrett asked. Sold out and started over somewhere easier? Never. This is ours. We built it from nothing. Vivian met his eyes. Besides, easier isn't always better. Sometimes the hard thing is the right thing. Even when it's dangerous? Especially then. Later, lying in bed with Vivian asleep against his shoulder, Garrett thought about danger and choice. They could have played it safe, accepted their limitations, avoided conflict, survived quietly. But survival wasn't the same as living, and somehow, in fighting for this stubborn patch of Wyoming prairie, they'd found something worth the risk. He fell asleep thinking about the future. Not the uncertain tomorrow or the threatening Crawfords, but the long-term future. The ranch expanding, maybe children running in the fields, Vivian growing old beside him with that fierce determination never dimming. It was terrifying to want something that badly. But terror, he was learning, was just the price of caring about things that mattered. And Vivian Hale, the woman he'd found broken at a crossroads and who'd somehow put him back together in return, mattered more than anything else in his carefully reconstructed life. The marshal arrived 3 weeks later, a lean man named Coleman, who'd seen enough frontier justice to be cynical about most of it. He spent 2 days documenting the damaged fence, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing Vivian's meticulous records. You've built a solid case, he told them on the second evening. But solid doesn't always mean winnable. The Crawfords have lawyers. Good ones. So do we, Vivian said. One lawyer in Cheyenne versus a firm in Denver? Coleman shook his head. I'm not trying to discourage you. Just want you to understand what you're facing. We understand, Garrett said. We're doing it anyway. Coleman studied them both for a long moment. You know what I see? Two people too stubborn to know when they're outmatched. That's either going to save you or destroy you. Which one are you betting on? Vivian asked. Honestly, I'm not sure yet. He gathered his papers. I'll file my report. It'll go on record. But don't expect the Crawfords to back down just because there's official documentation. People like that only respond to real consequences. After he left, Vivian stood at the window watching the sun drop toward the horizon. He's right, you know. We might lose this. Yeah. You're not going to try to convince me otherwise? Would it help? No. She turned to face him. But I need you to understand something. If this goes badly, if we lose the ranch, if we end up with nothing, I won't regret fighting. I'll only regret it if we give up without trying. Garrett crossed to her and pulled her close. Then we don't give up. Even if it costs us everything? We've both lost everything before. We survived it then. We'd survive it again. She leaned into him, and they stood like that while darkness crept across the prairie. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of distant rain. Inside, two people held each other and prepared for whatever came next. The Crawford response came faster than expected. A formal letter arrived demanding they cease making slanderous accusations and threatening legal action for defamation. It was signed by 3 lawyers and copied to half the territory. Vivian read it twice, then laughed. They're scared. That's your takeaway from a legal threat? Absolutely. If they weren't worried, they'd ignore us. Sending lawyers means we're actually causing problems. She set the letter aside. We need to push harder. How? By making this public. The Crawfords operate in shadows, intimidating people quietly. We bring it into the light, they lose their advantage. You want to go to the newspapers? I want to make enough noise that ignoring us becomes harder than dealing with us. It was a risky strategy, but Garrett had learned to trust Vivian's instincts about these things. She understood power dynamics in ways his direct approach never had. Over the next week, Vivian wrote letters to newspapers in 3 territories. Detailed accounts of the harassment, the sabotage, the systematic intimidation of small ranchers. She didn't just tell their story, she told all of them. Every rancher who'd been pushed out, every family who'd lost their land to Crawford pressure. "You're making enemies," Garrett warned. "We already have enemies. Now at least other people will know why." The first article ran in the Cheyenne paper 2 weeks later. "Frontier ranchers fight back against land barons," read the headline. It painted the Crawfords as exactly what they were, wealthy bullies using their resources to crush competition. The response was immediate and explosive. Nathaniel Crawford himself appeared at their property line 3 days after publication. He didn't cross onto their land, just sat on his horse 20 feet away and waited until Garrett and Vivian came out. "You've made a serious mistake," he called. "Which one?" Vivian asked. "There have been so many lately." "This newspaper nonsense, these lies you're spreading. Everything in that article is documented truth. If you'd like to dispute any specific claim, I have records." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "You think publicity protects you? All you've done is paint a target on your backs." The target was already there. Now at least people are watching. People forget. Newspapers move on to news stories, and when they do, you'll still be here, alone, vulnerable. Garrett stepped forward. "Is that a threat?" "It's reality. You're small ranchers playing games you don't understand. My family has been in this territory for 30 years. We'll be here 30 years from now. Will you?" "Guess we'll find out," Vivian said. Nathaniel looked at her with something like grudging respect. "You've changed since I left you at that crossroads. Grown a spine." "I always had a spine. You just never bothered to notice." "My mistake." He gathered his reins. "Don't make one yourself by thinking this ends well for you." He rode off, and Garrett felt Vivian shaking beside him. Not from fear, from barely contained rage. "I want to destroy him," she said quietly. "Is that wrong?" "No, it's human. I keep thinking about that woman sitting in the rain, how broken she was, how close to just giving up." Her hands curled into fists. "He did that. His casual cruelty, his complete disregard for whether I lived or died. And he feels nothing about it. People like that don't feel guilt. They're built different. Then I'll teach him to feel consequences." The article had consequences beyond their confrontation with Nathaniel. Other ranchers reached out, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of Crawford intimidation. The alliance Vivian had been building gained momentum. More importantly, investors from back east started asking questions. The Crawfords had been trying to secure funding for a major expansion, and suddenly potential backers were hesitant. Nobody wanted to invest in a family accused of systematic harassment in territorial newspapers. "We're hurting them," Vivian said, reviewing the correspondence. "Not destroying them, but causing real damage to their reputation and finances." "They'll retaliate." "I know. We need to be ready." They reinforced security around the ranch, hired 2 hands, brothers named Sam and Jacob, who'd been pushed out by the Crawfords years ago and were eager to push back. Started varying their routines even more, making sure someone was always watching the property. The retaliation came on a Tuesday night. Garrett woke to Duke screaming. Not the normal sounds horses made, something desperate and terrified. He was out of bed and running before his brain fully processed what was happening. The barn was on fire. Flames climbed the far wall, spreading fast through dry wood. Smoke poured through gaps in the boards, thick and black. Inside, the horses were panicking. "Vivian!" Garrett yelled back toward the cabin. "Fire!" He hit the barn door at full speed, yanking it open. Heat blasted out, singeing his eyebrows. Duke was in his stall, wild-eyed and kicking. 2 other horses were beyond him, and Garrett could hear them screaming. No time to think, just move. He got Duke's stall open and the gelding bolted past him toward freedom. The smoke was worse now, burning Garrett's lungs, making his eyes stream. He couldn't see the other stalls clearly, was navigating by memory and sound. Something crashed behind him, part of the roof giving way. Garrett grabbed the second horse's halter, dragged it toward the door. The animal fought him, terrified by fire and smoke, but Garrett was stronger and more desperate. He got it outside just as Vivian appeared with buckets. "One more horse," he shouted. "The roof's going!" "I know." He went back in. Stupid, probably suicidal, but he couldn't leave the animal to burn. The third horse was at the back of the barn, where the fire was worst. Garrett's vision was going gray from smoke inhalation. His skin was blistering from heat, but he found the stall and got it open. The horse reared, hooves missing Garrett's head by inches. He grabbed its mane, used its own panic to guide it toward the door. Behind them, more roof collapsed. Sparks rained down like hellfire. They made it outside as the entire structure groaned. Garrett stumbled away from the barn, coughing so hard he thought his lungs would come up. The horse ran toward the others. Vivian was suddenly beside him, supporting his weight. "You're insane," she said, but her voice was shaking. "Horses are expensive." "You're an idiot." Sam and Jacob had appeared from the bunkhouse with more buckets, but it was too late. The barn was gone. They focused on keeping the fire from spreading to other buildings, creating a perimeter of wet ground that the flames couldn't cross. By dawn, they had it contained. The barn was a smoking ruin, but the cabin and other structures were safe. The horses were traumatized but alive, and Garrett's hands were covered in burns that would take weeks to heal. Vivian bandaged him while the sun came up, her movements gentle, but her expression furious. "This was them," she said. "Probably." "Not probably. Definitely. This was the Crawfords sending a message." "Can't prove it." "I don't need proof. I know." She finished wrapping his hands and stood, looking at the destroyed barn. "We're going to end this." "How?" "By hitting them where it actually hurts." Over the next few days, while Garrett healed and they cleaned up the wreckage, Vivian investigated. She talked to the ranch hands Sam and Jacob knew, reached out to people in town who might have information, built a picture of Crawford operations that went beyond surface respectability. What she found was damning. The Crawfords had been falsifying property records, claiming land they didn't actually own. They'd been intimidating county clerks into filing paperwork that gave them legal ownership of disputed territories. Some of the land they claimed included federal parcels that should have been available for homesteading. "This is fraud," Vivian said, spreading documents across their table. "Large-scale, systematic fraud, and it's all documented if you know where to look." "How did you find this?" "The uncomfortable kid from the fence fire? His name is Henry Peterson. His mother works in the county clerk's office. She's been making copies of questionable documents for years, waiting for someone brave enough to use them." Garrett studied the papers. "This could destroy them." "That's the idea." "It'll also make us targets for worse than barn fires." "I know." Vivian met his eyes. "But we're already targets. At least this way we're fighting back with something that matters." They took the documents to the territorial attorney, a serious woman named Elizabeth Grayson, who'd built her career on taking down corrupt land deals. She reviewed everything with an intensity that reminded Garrett of Vivian. "This is extraordinary," Grayson said finally. "If even half of this holds up, the Crawfords will face criminal charges, prison time for Nathaniel and possibly his brother." "How long until you can move forward?" Vivian asked. "I need to verify everything independently, cross-reference with federal records. Build an airtight case." She paused. "This will take months, maybe longer. Can you stay safe that long?" "We'll manage." "These people burned your barn. What happens when they realize you're building a criminal case against them?" "We'll be careful." Grayson shook her head. "Careful might not be enough. You're talking about destroying one of the most powerful families in the territory. They won't go quietly." "Neither will we," Garrett said. Word got out anyway. Not the specifics of the case, but enough that the Crawfords knew something was coming. The harassment intensified. Cattle spooked in the night, equipment sabotaged, supplies that went missing or arrived damaged. But the alliance Vivian had built held. Other ranchers provided backup, witnesses, replacement supplies. What would have destroyed them alone became manageable with support. And through it all, Garrett watched his wife become something formidable. Not the broken woman from the crossroads or even the determined partner who'd nursed him through his injury. Something sharper and more dangerous. "You're enjoying this," he said one evening. "What?" "The fight. You're actually enjoying it." Vivian considered this. "Maybe I am. Is that bad?" "Not bad. Just interesting." "You spent months terrified of the Crawfords. Now you're going after them like a wolf after wounded prey." "They made it personal when they left me to die. Everything since has just been confirmation that they're exactly as terrible as I thought." She paused. "And yes, there's satisfaction in proving they're not untouchable, that wealth and power don't make you immune to consequences. What if the consequences land on us instead?" Then at least we'll go down fighting instead of cowering. 6 months after the barn fire, Attorney Grayson filed formal charges: fraud, bribery, illegal land acquisition, intimidation. The list ran 2 pages. Federal marshals arrested Nathaniel and Thomas Crawford on a cold November morning. The news spread through the territory like wildfire. Garrett and Vivian were in town when it happened. They watched the Crawford brothers being led out in handcuffs, Nathaniel's face red with rage, Thomas looking genuinely shocked. Martha Cunningham appeared beside them on the street. "Never thought I'd see the day." "Neither did we," Vivian admitted. "You two did this. Everyone knows it. The Crawfords did this to themselves. We just made sure people found out." Martha studied her. "You've changed a lot since you first came to town. That scared woman in the general store is gone." "She was never really there, just hidden under shock and fear." "Well, hidden or not, she's definitely gone now." Martha smiled. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you stayed. Glad you fought. This territory needs people with spine." After she left, Garrett turned to Vivian. "How does it feel?" "Surreal. Like I should feel more victorious, but I'm just tired." "That's normal. We've been fighting for months. Now that it's over, the exhaustion catches up." "Is it over, though? The trial hasn't happened yet. But the worst is done. They're facing real consequences. Everything else is just details." They walked back to the wagon hand in hand. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful in its harshness. This land had nearly killed Vivian, had tested them both past reasonable limits, had demanded more than either thought they could give. And somehow they'd survived it. Not just survived, thrived. The trial took 4 months. Garrett and Vivian testified, as did a dozen other ranchers. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted both Crawford brothers on multiple counts. Nathaniel got 8 years, Thomas got 5. Their ranch was broken up and sold to pay fines and restitution. Standing outside the courthouse after the verdict, Vivian was quiet. "You all right?" Garrett asked. "I keep thinking about those letters, the beautiful promises. How much I wanted to believe them. You were looking for a different life." "I was running from reality, from grief and responsibility, and the hard work of actually building something." She turned to him. "Crawford offered me an easy answer, a ready-made life that required nothing from me except showing up. And I offered you nothing except hard work and uncertainty. You offered me partnership, real partnership, not pretty words. You offered me the chance to build something that actually mattered." "Not sure I offered anything. You kind of forced your way into my life and refused to leave." She laughed. "True. I was very pushy about not dying in the wilderness. Terribly inconsiderate." They rode home as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The ranch had been rebuilt. New barn, expanded grazing land, twice as many cattle as they'd started with. What had begun as Garrett's isolated homestead had become a real operation. More than that, it had become a home. That night, lying in bed with Vivian asleep beside him, Garrett thought about the past year, about the woman he'd found at a muddy crossroads, and the partnership they'd accidentally built while trying to survive. He'd spent 7 years alone, convinced isolation was safety, that wanting nothing meant risking nothing. Then Vivian appeared and destroyed every assumption he'd made about himself. She'd forced him to care when caring was terrifying, to fight when fighting seemed impossible, to believe that building something real was worth the constant risk of losing it. "You awake?" Vivian murmured. "Yeah. What are you thinking about?" "How different everything is from a year ago." "Better or worse?" "Better. Definitely better." She rolled over to face him. "Even with the barn fire and the Crawfords and all the nights you probably wanted to murder me for being difficult, especially because of those things, they proved we could survive the hard stuff together." "We did survive it, didn't we?" She sounded almost surprised. "We actually won." "Yeah. So what now?" It was a good question. They'd spent so long fighting that victory felt strange, empty of immediate purpose. "Now we build," Garrett said. "Expand the ranch. Maybe start thinking about a bigger house." "Why bigger?" "In case we need more room eventually." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Are you talking about children?" "Maybe, if you want." "I don't know if I'd be good at that." "You weren't sure you'd be good at ranching either. turned out fine. Ranching doesn't involve tiny humans who depend on you for everything. True, but we'd figure it out. Same way we figured out everything else. She curled against him. Ask me again in a year, after we've had time to breathe and not be fighting for survival. Fair enough, but Garrett could see it now. The future he'd never let himself imagine. Children running in the fields, the ranch growing into something that outlasted them both. Growing old with someone who actually understood him instead of dying alone like he'd always assumed. It was terrifying how much he wanted it. Spring arrived with the kind of optimism that only comes after surviving hard winters. The prairie exploded into green, wildflowers appeared in impossible places, and the ranch buzzed with activity as they prepared for another year. Vivian was in the garden, a real garden now, not just transplanted wildflowers, when Garrett came looking for her. Letter came, he said, holding out an envelope. She wiped dirt from her hands and took it, her sister's handwriting. Vivian stared at it for a long moment before opening it. The letter was short, an acknowledgement of Vivian's previous response, an apology that sounded genuine, an invitation to visit if Vivian ever wanted to reconcile. What will you do? Garrett asked. Nothing. Not yet, anyway. She folded the letter carefully. Maybe someday I'll be ready to forgive her, but that day isn't today. And if it never comes, then it never comes. I've built a life I actually like. I don't need her approval or presence to validate it. She went back to planting, and Garrett stood watching her. This woman who'd arrived broken and desperate had become the strongest person he knew. Not because she was fearless, she was terrified constantly, but because she chose to act despite the fear. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Duke grazed nearby, the chickens were settling for the night, and everything felt almost peaceful. Tell me something, Vivian said. What? If you could go back to that day, the storm, the crossroads, finding me there, would you do it again? Knowing everything that came after? Garrett didn't need to think about it. Every single time. Even the barn fire? Even that. The Crawfords, the fighting, all of it? All of it. Because it led here. He took her hand. To this. To us actually being us instead of two people pretending to have a business arrangement. Vivian leaned her head on his shoulder. I used to think love was supposed to feel easy, like in those letters Crawford wrote. Beautiful words, pretty promises, everything smooth. And now? Now I think real love is choosing someone every day, even when it's hard. Even when you're exhausted and scared and not sure you can keep going. It's showing up and doing the work because the alternative is losing something that matters. That's a lot less romantic than poetry. It's a lot more honest, though. Garrett kissed the top of her head. I choose you, every day, even when you're being difficult. I'm not difficult. I'm particular. That's what difficult people call themselves. She elbowed him gently. You're one to talk. Mister, I've lived alone for 7 years and prefer it that way. Past tense, preferred. So you admit you like having me around. I tolerate your presence. Liar. Fine. I might be slightly attached to you. Slightly? Moderately to significantly attached. Better. She was quiet for a moment. I love you, Garrett Hale, even though you're stubborn and grumpy and terrible at expressing emotions. I love you too, even though you're bossy and reckless and make me care about things when I'd rather stay numb. They sat like that until the stars came out, two people who'd found each other in a storm and chosen to stay together through everything that followed. The ranch continued growing. Within 2 years, they were one of the most successful operations in the territory. Other ranchers came to Vivian for advice. Garrett's reputation as someone who couldn't be intimidated spread. Together, they became the kind of couple people told stories about. But those stories missed the important parts. The quiet mornings over coffee. The arguments about money and expansion that ended with compromise. The nights when fear overwhelmed them both and they had to remind each other why fighting was worth it. They missed how Vivian still woke sometimes from nightmares about sitting in the rain, and Garrett would hold her until the fear passed. How Garrett still struggled with his father's voice in his head, and Vivian would talk him through it with patient understanding. The stories made it sound easy, like they'd found each other and everything fell into place. The truth was messier and more beautiful. They fought. They failed. They made mistakes and hurt each other and had to learn how to apologize and forgive. Building a real partnership turned out to be harder than fighting the Crawfords, but they kept choosing each other every single day. 5 years after the storm, Vivian gave birth to a daughter. They named her Eleanor after Garrett's mother. She had Vivian's dark hair and Garrett's stubborn disposition, and from the moment she arrived, she owned them completely. Garrett discovered that fatherhood was terrifying in entirely new ways. The responsibility of another life depending on him brought up every fear his own father had instilled. "What if I mess her up?" he asked Vivian one night, while Eleanor slept between them. "You won't." "How do you know?" "Because you're already worried about it. Your father never questioned himself, never thought he might be doing damage. That self-awareness is what makes you different." "What if it's not enough? Then we'll deal with it together, same way we deal with everything else." Eleanor grew up on stories about the storm that brought her parents together, about the ranch they built from nothing, about fighting when fighting seemed impossible and choosing each other when easier options existed. She grew up strong and fierce, with her mother's strategic mind and her father's work ethic. By the time she was 10, she could outride most adults and argue like a lawyer. "She's going to be formidable," Vivian said, watching Eleanor convince Sam to let her help with cattle work, despite being too young. "Wonder where she gets that," Garrett said dryly. "Definitely your side of the family." "Right, because you're so mild and agreeable." Vivian grinned. "Absolutely. I'm known for my compliance and sweet nature." They never did rebuild the relationship with Vivian's sister. Some wounds didn't heal, and forcing forgiveness helped no one. But Vivian made peace with it. She'd built her own family from scratch: Garrett, Eleanor, the ranch community that had formed around them. Blood didn't make family. Choice did. Showing up every day and doing the work made family. Garrett's father died when Eleanor was 12. The news came in a terse telegram from a cousin Garrett barely remembered. He felt nothing at first. Then a complicated grief that had more to do with what could have been than what actually was. "You want to go to the funeral?" Vivian asked. "No, he was dead to me long before this." "You're allowed to mourn what you didn't have." "I did that years ago. This is just his body catching up." But that night, Garrett stood on the porch looking at the ranch he'd built, the life he'd created, the family he'd chosen. And he realized his father's greatest failure wasn't the violence or the cruelty. It was the refusal to change, the inability to look at damage done and choose differently. Garrett had broken that cycle. Not perfectly. He still struggled, still had days when fear overwhelmed everything else. But he kept choosing to be better, to do better. And that choice, repeated daily for years, had created something his father never could have imagined. 20 years after the storm, Garrett and Vivian sat on the porch of their expanded house watching the sun set over land they'd fought for and won. Eleanor was off at university back east, studying law and planning to come home and help manage the ranch empire her parents had built. "Think she'll actually come back?" Garrett asked. "She'll come back. This place is in her blood. She could have an easier life in the city." "She could. But she's our daughter. She doesn't want easy. She wants meaningful." Garrett took Vivian's hand. 20 years together, and the sight of her still made something settle in his chest. She was older now, gray threading through her dark hair, laugh lines around her eyes, more beautiful than the woman he'd found at the crossroads. "No regrets?" he asked. "About what?" "All of it. Staying when you could have left, fighting when you could have run, building this instead of taking easier options." Vivian was quiet for a moment, considering. "I regret Crawford's letters, not because I believed them, but because they delayed me finding something real. I regret the years before my parents died that I wasted being someone I thought I should be instead of who I actually was. But this? Us? Never." She squeezed his hand. "You saved my life that night, but I didn't realize until later that I saved yours too. We rescued each other." "From what?" "From lives that looked safe but were slowly killing us. You were dying of isolation. I was dying of purposelessness. We gave each other reasons to actually live." Garrett pulled her close, and they sat watching the prairie turn gold in the fading light. The same prairie that had nearly killed them both, that had tested them past breaking, and somehow they'd survived. Not survived. Thrived. They'd built something real from nothing, from a storm and desperation and two people too stubborn to quit, even when quitting made sense. "Tell me something," Vivian said. "The day you found me. Did you know?" "Know what?" "That everything was about to change. That saving me would mean saving yourself." "No, I just knew someone needed help and I could provide it. No grand romantic moment, no love at first sight. You were half dead and in shock. Romance wasn't exactly on my mind." "When then? When did you know?" Garrett thought back. Not the wedding. That had been practical. Not the first time they made love. That had been terrifying. Not even when she'd rebuilt the ranch while he was injured. That had been impressive, but not revelatory. "The flowers," he said finally. "What?" "When you planted flowers outside the cabin. The ones that died in 3 days. That's when I knew." "Why?" "Because you planted them anyway, knowing they'd probably die. Knowing this was supposed to be temporary. You planted them because even temporary places deserve beauty. That's when I understood you weren't going anywhere." Vivian's eyes went bright. "You remember that?" "I remember everything about you." "Even the difficult parts?" "Especially those." They sat until the stars came out, the same stars that had shone the night they met, the same Wyoming sky that had nearly killed her with its storm. And Garrett thought about the woman sitting beside him, the one who'd transformed from hollow-eyed and abandoned to fierce and unbreakable, the one who'd taught him that choosing to care was braver than choosing to hide. Life hadn't gotten easier. The ranch still demanded constant work. Money was still tight some years. They still fought about decisions and worried about the future, but they faced it together. And that made all the difference. Years from now, when people told stories about Garrett and Vivian Hale, they'd focus on the dramatic parts. The storm, the Crawfords, the legal battle. They'd make it sound like a romance, all passion and triumph. They'd miss the truth. That real love wasn't the storm that brought them together. It was the quiet choice, repeated daily for decades, to keep showing up, to keep working, to keep choosing each other even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. The storm had been one night. Their choice to build something from that night's chaos had been 20 years of work. And they'd do it all again. Every difficult moment, every terrifying decision, every day they woke up and chose to fight for what they were building instead of retreating into what felt safe. Because safe wasn't the same as living. And after years of just surviving, they'd finally learned how to actually live. Together. Imperfectly. Stubbornly refusing to quit, even when the frontier tried its best to break them. That was the real story. Not the storm that brought them together, but the deliberate choice that kept them that way. And as the Wyoming night settled around them, cold and clear and endless, Garrett Hale understood something his father never had. That vulnerability wasn't weakness. That choosing to care wasn't surrender. That building something with someone else was infinitely stronger than standing alone. He'd spent 7 years believing isolation made him safe. Then a woman appeared in a storm and taught him that safety was an illusion. Connection was the only thing that mattered. And love, real love, the difficult kind that required work and choice and showing up every single day, was the only thing worth building a life around. Everything else was just weather.